I used to believe that a medical degree and 15 years of research experience would be enough to earn respect in any family. I was wrong. When I married James Mitchell, heir to Mitchell Healthcare Solutions, I thought my contributions to medical science would be valued in a family whose fortune came from healthcare innovation. The irony still stings when I think about it. 3 years ago, I stood on the balcony of our San Juan Islands vacation home, watching Eleanor Mitchell's unexpected arrival by seaplane. James squeezed my hand as the aircraft touched down on the crystalline water. "Mom's just checking in," he whispered, but we both knew it was more than that. She was checking on me, on us, on the research documents she'd later discover in my suitcase. Documents that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For 8 years, I, Rebecca Kendall Mitchell, had been the dutiful daughter-in-law to Boston's most prestigious medical dynasty. I'd abandoned my promising research career at Johns Hopkins to join Mitchell Healthcare's development team, where my innovations were consistently shelved for being too experimental, despite their potential. I'd learned to speak with measured enthusiasm at charity galas, where Eleanor showcased James's minor contributions, while conveniently forgetting to mention my role in developing the prototypes. I'd postponed our plans for children because Richard, my father-in-law, insisted James needed to focus on the European expansion first. "Family supports family," Eleanor would declare during their lavish holiday gatherings, raising her crystal flute of champagne while her eyes swept past me as if I were merely decorative, a necessary accessory to their son's professional image. James would press his knee against mine under the table when this happened, a gesture I mistook for solidarity rather than the quiet apology it actually was. When I married James, I wasn't just marrying the man with kind eyes and a brilliant mind for medical technology. I was marrying into the Mitchell legacy. The family's medical equipment empire spanned 5 continents, their name emblazoned on hospital wings and research facilities across the country. Their product catalog read like a medical textbook's appendix, each device more essential than the last. Their annual family retreats were legendary among Boston's elite. 2 weeks at exclusive destinations where leisure activities conveniently aligned with strategic business planning. For the first 3 years of our marriage, I wasn't invited to these retreats. "It's mostly business talk, Becca," James would explain, packing his carefully selected wardrobe into monogrammed luggage. "You'd be bored to tears analyzing market forecasts and regulatory landscapes." I accepted this explanation, though it stung deeply. I was, after all, a published researcher with a doctorate in biomedical engineering. I understood healthcare, markets, and regulatory frameworks better than most of the Mitchell family, but I remained silent, believing that proving my worth meant patience and understanding. By the 4th year, I'd earned an invitation, or so I thought. In reality, they needed me. The family's latest acquisition, a medical device startup specializing in non-invasive diagnostic tools, was struggling to meet FDA approval timelines. My background in regulatory compliance suddenly made me valuable. I spent that retreat rewriting protocols, adjusting technical specifications, and developing clinical trial frameworks. The startup received FDA clearance 4 months later, months ahead of the revised schedule. The Mitchell Healthcare newsletter credited the family's persistent commitment to excellence for the success. After that, I was included in the annual retreats, though always with the unspoken expectation, make yourself useful. And I did, year after year, contributing insights on medical innovations, suggesting improvements to existing product lines, and even managing difficult conversations with regulatory agencies with a diplomatic touch that Richard himself acknowledged was surprisingly effective for someone with an academic background. I believed I was building my place in the family, earning my seat at the table through competence and dedication. I thought I was finally becoming a Mitchell in more than just name. Every family has its dynamics, of course. I wasn't blind to Eleanor's occasional cutting remarks about theoretical knowledge versus practical business sense, or the way Olivia, James's sister, would sometimes roll her eyes when I spoke about emerging medical research. But these seemed like small prices to pay for belonging to a family that appeared to value medical innovation and health improvements as much as I did. James and I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. The historic Beacon Hill townhouse, the weekend trips to their Cape Cod estate, the board positions at prestigious Boston hospitals, the features in Massachusetts Medical Society's influencer profiles. Beneath this glossy surface, however, cracks were beginning to show. James worked increasingly long hours, our conversations growing shorter and more perfunctory. When we did spend time together, his attention was often divided between me and his constantly vibrating phone. The Singapore regulatory team, he'd explain, or Dad needs these clinical projections tonight. I accepted these explanations because I understood ambition. I had sacrificed my own career advancement to support his, after all. What I didn't realize, what I refused to see, was that I had become just another acquisition in the Mitchell portfolio, a useful asset maintained as long as I provided value, but never truly part of the collection. I was the prototype in development. That could be shelved when a more profitable project came along. This year's family retreat was to be held at Cascadia Grove Resort in the San Juan Islands, a newly opened luxury wellness destination that had already hosted celebrities and tech, billionaires seeking exclusive rejuvenation. The planning had begun months in advance, with Eleanor sending her usual detailed itineraries and packing suggestions. I had been excited, researching the innovative wellness therapies offered at the resort and preparing ideas for Mitchell Healthcare's potential expansion into preventative medicine and holistic health technologies. 2 weeks before departure, I sat at our home office finalizing a presentation on integrating alternative medicine protocols with conventional medical devices, a direction I thought might impress Richard, when James arrived home later than usual. He loosened his tie, poured himself a scotch, and leaned against my desk with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We need to talk about the San Juan Islands trip," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I'm almost finished with the preventative medicine presentation," I replied, turning my laptop toward him. "I think your father will be impressed with the market projections for integrated wellness devices." James took a long sip of his drink. "That's the thing, Becca. Mom and Dad think this year's retreat should be focused exclusively on succession planning. Very private, very sensitive discussions." I waited for him to continue, a strange feeling beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. We think, it might be better if you sit this one out, just this year." His voice was gentle but firm, as if he were explaining something regrettable but necessary to a child. "Succession planning?" I repeated, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm your wife, James. Doesn't that make me part of the succession discussion?" He sighed, setting down his glass. "It's complicated. There are things about the family holdings, trust structures that, well, Dad's lawyers have advised a certain level of discretion." "Discretion?" I echoed. "From your wife of 8 years?" James reached for my hand, his wedding band catching the light. "It's just business, Becca. You understand business." In that moment, something crystallized within me. A realization that had been forming for years, but that I had refused to acknowledge. I wasn't family. I was an outsider, tolerated when useful, excluded when convenience demanded it. And James, the man who had vowed to make me his partner in all things, saw nothing wrong with this arrangement. Little did they know I understood business better than they thought. Much better. My dedication to the Mitchell family hadn't just been about attending their events or learning their customs. It had been a complete reinvention of myself. When I met James at a medical conference in Boston, I was Rebecca Kendall, a rising star in medical research with publications in prestigious journals and a reputation for innovative clinical approaches. My colleagues used to joke that I could make the most complex medical concepts accessible to anyone. I had my own apartment in Cambridge, a close circle of fellow researchers, and a 5-year plan that involved leading my own research department focused on integrative medicine approaches. Then came James, with his thoughtful questions about my research and family legacy. Our courtship was a whirlwind of private conversations about changing the landscape of healthcare, weekend trips to medical innovation conferences, and dreams of combining our expertise. When he proposed after just 10 months, my research partners expressed concern about the speed, but I was certain this wasn't just about love. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was about potential, about building something extraordinary together in the medical field. The sacrifices began small but multiplied quickly. First, it was moving from my Cambridge apartment to James's Beacon Hill townhouse. The commute to Johns Hopkins would be impossible, I had pointed out. Why don't you take some time to focus on independent research? James had suggested. You've been working so hard. Besides, Mom's foundation could use your expertise on their medical advisory board. That time off stretched into resignation when Eleanor made it clear that no Mitchell spouse maintained a separate career. Divided focus leads to divided success, she'd explained over lunch at her country club, her tennis bracelet catching the light as she patted my hand. The family business requires full commitment. So I channeled my ambition into being the perfect Mitchell spouse. I reorganized our home office to better facilitate James' work on the company's new projects. I arranged dinner parties for his business associates, ensuring each event was both impressive and strategically valuable. I accompanied him to medical conferences, memorizing details about potential partners so I could guide conversations toward successful deals. When Richard needed help navigating a complex FDA approval process for one of their struggling product lines, I spent 4 months developing a comprehensive regulatory strategy. I worked 14-hour days conducting compliance research, redesigning clinical trial protocols, and creating a regulatory pathway that would expedite approval. I presented my findings in a detailed report complete with implementation timelines and risk mitigation strategies. Richard had nodded approvingly. Not bad for someone from the research side, he'd said before handing the report to his regulatory affairs team without crediting my work. The device's subsequent successful approval was attributed to the Mitchell approach to regulatory excellence in the company's quarterly newsletter. I swallowed my frustration because that's what family does, isn't it? They contribute without expecting constant recognition. Besides, James had been proud, telling me privately that his father was impressed, even if he wouldn't say it directly. The personal sacrifices were even more significant. At 34, I had wanted to start trying for a baby, but Eleanor had pulled me aside during one family dinner. "Darling, children change everything," she'd said, her voice lowered conspiratorially. "James is just about to take over the European regulatory division. A pregnancy now would be inconvenient." James had agreed when I'd brought it up later that night. "Mom's right, Becca. Let's give it another year or two. The timing isn't right." That had been 3 years ago. Each time I raised the subject, there was always another expansion, another acquisition, another reason to wait. Meanwhile, Olivia had given birth to her second child, with Eleanor flying to New York to stay with her for a month after the delivery. When I'd mentioned this discrepancy, James had shrugged. "Olivia's husband isn't directly involved in operations. It's different for us." I had stopped bringing it up. Instead, I channeled my energy into proving my worth to the family in other ways. When Sophia, Daniel's wife, struggled to fit in with the Mitchell social circle, I became her guide and defender, helping her navigate the complex expectations and unspoken rules. When Richard's 60th birthday approached, I spent months secretly compiling a leather-bound book of congratulatory messages from medical professionals and healthcare innovators he admired. When the Family Foundation needed to raise its profile in the medical community, I organized a symposium that attracted coverage in major medical journals and raised twice the expected amount for rare disease research. My own family fell by the wayside as I immersed myself in Mitchell priorities. I missed my sister's doctoral defense because it conflicted with an investor weekend at the Cape Cod house. I cut short visits to my parents because Eleanor would call with urgent consultation needs that somehow always coincided with my rare time away. My fellow researchers' invitations became less frequent as I repeatedly canceled plans for Mitchell obligations. My father had noticed the change during his last visit to Boston. "You seem tired, Becca Bear," he'd said, using my childhood nickname. "And that spark when you talk about your research, it's dimmed. Are you happy here?" "I'm just busy, Dad," I'd replied, showing him the view from our townhouse as if the Boston skyline were evidence of my contentment. "The family business requires a lot of attention." He'd given me a long look before saying, "Just remember, the purpose of medicine is healing, including healing yourself." I had changed the subject, uncomfortable with his perception. The truth was, I had been proud of my ability to adapt, to transform myself into someone the Mitchells could accept. Each sacrifice felt like an investment in our shared future. Each compromise seemed like a stepping stone toward true belonging. I had believed that eventually there would be a return on these investments: recognition, inclusion, genuine acceptance as a Mitchell. 8 years of carefully calculated choices. 8 years of putting their needs before my own. 8 years of proving myself again and again. And now, with a single conversation about the San Juan Islands trip, James had made it clear: no amount of sacrifice would ever be enough. I would always be the outsider, useful but ultimately expendable. As I sat at our home office watching James fidget with his empty Scotch glass, I realized that the person I had become, this polished, accommodating version of Rebecca, was unrecognizable to the passionate researcher I had once been. I had given the Mitchells everything, even pieces of myself I hadn't known were negotiable. And what had I received in return? A beautiful townhouse that never quite felt like home. A husband who viewed our marriage as secondary to family strategy. And now, the final indignity: exclusion from a family retreat because I wasn't family enough to be trusted with sensitive discussions. "It's not like you'd enjoy it anyway," James continued, reaching for the Scotch bottle to pour himself another drink. "You know how intense these planning sessions get. Dad and Daniel arguing over market positioning, Mom micromanaging every presentation." He offered a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring. I kept my expression neutral, though my mind was racing. When exactly was this decision made? James busied himself with adding a single ice cube to his glass. "We discussed it during the board meeting last Thursday. The day I'd brought lunch to his office because he'd mentioned having back-to-back meetings. I'd sat in the reception area for 45 minutes before his assistant told me he was unavailable. He'd texted later, "Sorry, babe. Meetings ran long. See you at home." So everyone knows except me? Olivia, Thomas, Daniel, Sophia? They all know I'm not invited? James winced slightly. "It's not a big deal, Becca. You're making it sound like some sort of conspiracy. What am I supposed to do while you're all in the San Juan Islands for 2 weeks?" I asked, closing my laptop with more force than necessary. "Actually, that's the other thing," James said, his tone brightening as if he were about to offer good news. "Mom suggested you could use the time to review the clinical trial data from the Cambridge facility. The results have been inconsistent, and someone needs to identify the variables." The Cambridge facility. The cold, sterile research lab where Mitchell Healthcare tested their least promising products. The place where innovative ideas went to die under the weight of bureaucracy and conservative thinking. "You want me to analyze failed trials while..." "You're at a luxury resort. It's not analyzing failures, Becca," James frowned. "It's troubleshooting. You're good at that sort of thing. You've got an eye for research anomalies." So I'm good enough to salvage problematic data, but not good enough to be included in family succession planning. That's not fair, James Sebari said, his voice hardening slightly. This is business. It's family business, I countered. And apparently, I'm not family. James set his glass down with a sharp click against the desk. You're being dramatic. It's one trip. It's not about the trip, James. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture I once found endearing, but now recognized as a signal of his impatience. What is it about then? Please enlighten me. I wanted to tell him everything, how I felt perpetually on probation, with his family, how I'd sacrificed my own ambitions to support his, how I'd postponed motherhood because his mother thought it inconvenient. But looking at him standing there, defensive and irritated rather than understanding, I knew he wouldn't. Hear me. Not really. Never mind, I said quietly. When do you leave? Relief washed over his features. He thought the storm had passed. Next Friday. The jet leaves at 9 a.m. I nodded, already formulating questions he wouldn't expect. Who's handling the FDA submission while you're gone? Amanda, he replied, referring to his new regulatory specialist. She'll coordinate with the legal team. And the clinical trial for the non-invasive glucose monitor? Wasn't that supposed to conclude before you leave? The data analysis team will handle it, he said, seemingly pleased by my apparent interest, in business details rather than the personal slight. Everything's under control, Becca. The company won't collapse just because we take 2 weeks away. No, the company wouldn't collapse. But something had shifted in my world, a tectonic movement beneath the surface that James couldn't feel. I think I'll go lie down, I said, rising from my chair. I've got a headache. James nodded absently, already reaching for his phone, which had begun to vibrate. It's Dad, he said, not bothering to look up as I left the room. I walked slowly to our bedroom, closing the door behind me. Instead of lying down, I went to the walk-in closet, a room larger than my entire first apartment in Baltimore, and sank down onto the tufted ottoman in the center. Surrounding me were rows of designer clothes, shoes, and handbags, most purchased to meet the expectations of Mitchell events and appearances. From the adjoining bathroom came the faint smell of James's cologne. On his side of the closet hung precisely organized suits, color-coded ties, and monogrammed shirts. 8 years of shared space. Yet in that moment, everything felt foreign to me. I reached for my phone and pulled up my calendar. Not the shared one that James's assistant had access to, but my personal one. The next 2 weeks were filled with Mitchell-related commitments, a hospital board meeting Eleanor had insisted I join, a dinner with potential investors for James's latest project, a planning session for the Family Foundation's annual Medical Innovation Gala. None of these people would miss me if I didn't attend. None of them truly saw me as essential. My gaze drifted to the built-in safe where we kept important documents. James had never bothered to change the combination from his birth year, a carelessness that had always struck me as arrogant. With steady hands, I opened it and removed our passport folder, confirming that both our passports were current. Next to them sat a USB drive labeled RK Research. James didn't know about this drive or about the encrypted folder on my laptop, where I kept my independent research. Work I had continued in secret during early mornings and late nights when he was away on business trips. For years, I had been developing a revolutionary protocol for non-invasive treatment of autoimmune disorders, research the Mitchells had dismissed as too experimental and not commercially viable in the current regulatory climate. I returned everything to the safe except for my passport and the USB drive, which I slipped into my desk drawer. Then I picked up my laptop again and opened a private browsing window. The Cascadia Grove Resort's website appeared on the screen, showcasing infinity pools that seemed to merge with the Pacific Ocean, private cabins nestled among ancient cedars, and wellness facilities featuring cutting-edge therapeutic technologies. The Mitchells weren't the only ones with connections in the medical world. During my time at Johns Hopkins, I had worked extensively with holistic healing pioneers. One of my former colleagues, Dr. Alex Winters, had gone on to become the Chief Medical Officer for Integrated Wellness Properties, a competitor to the Mitchell Healthcare's nascent wellness division. Alex and I had stayed in touch over the years, meeting occasionally for coffee when he visited Boston. He had reached out multiple times about potential positions with his company, positions I had politely declined out of loyalty to the Mitchell family business. I scrolled through my contacts until I found his number, then hesitated for just a moment before typing a message. "Are you still interested in my autoimmune treatment protocol? I may have completed the research model and would like your opinion." His response came less than 3 minutes later. "Rebecca, absolutely interested. Your approach could revolutionize treatment modalities. When can we talk?" I confirmed a video call for the following morning, then set my phone aside, a plan beginning to form. Not a plan born of anger or immediate revenge, but something deeper, a reclaiming of the self I had gradually surrendered. From the living room, I could hear James's voice, animated as he discussed business with his father. He hadn't come to check on me, hadn't noticed that my headache might be something more significant. For the first time in years, I felt truly clear-headed. That night, I barely slept as James snored softly beside me. I stared at the ceiling, replaying not just our conversation about the San Juan Islands, but countless other moments from our marriage. I thought about the Christmas 3 years ago when Eleanor had accidentally excluded me from the family photo, then expressed exaggerated dismay when I pointed it out. "Oh dear, did we miss you? Well, we can't possibly redo it now. Everyone's already dispersing." I remembered the medical conference where Richard had introduced me to a prominent healthcare investor as James's wife. Despite my having met the same investor at a previous event and discussed his portfolio in detail. When I'd reminded Richard of this, he'd chuckled and said, "Well, all these technical conversations start to blend together," before turning the conversation back to Mitchell Healthcare's latest acquisition. I recalled how Olivia had once drunkenly confessed at a New Year's Eve party that Eleanor had asked all of them not to share certain family medical patents around me because outsiders don't need to know everything about proprietary technology. When I'd mentioned this to James the next day, he dismissed it as Olivia being dramatic and suggested I'd misunderstood. Each memory clicked into place like puzzle pieces forming a picture I'd refused to see. The Mitchells had never intended to accept me as one of their own. I had been auditioning for a role that was never actually available. And James had allowed it all. More than allowed, he had participated, prioritizing his family's comfort over his wife's inclusion at every turn. He had watched me twist myself into someone unrecognizable trying to gain acceptance, and he had said nothing. By morning, I felt strangely calm. The disappointment and hurt remained, but beneath them was something unexpected: relief. The exhausting performance could end. The constant seeking of approval could stop. The truth, however painful, was clarifying. James left early for a breakfast meeting, kissing my forehead perfunctorily and reminding me about the Cambridge facility data, as if our conversation the night before had resolved everything. "I'll have Gabriella email you the research parameters," he said, referring to his research coordinator. "Just identify the variables affecting the outcomes. You're good at that sort of thing." As good as invisible, I thought, but I simply nodded and wished him a good day. Once he was gone, I showered and dressed with unusual care, selecting a tailored navy suit I hadn't worn since my Johns Hopkins days. Then I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Alex Winters, confirming our video call and expanding its scope. "Something's come up," I explained. "I may have more research to share than I initially thought." The second was to my old friend Maya Rodriguez, who had left academic medicine to start her own biotech venture. We had drifted apart as my Mitchell obligations consumed my time, but she answered on the second ring, her voice warm with surprise. "Rebecca Kendall, to what do I owe this pleasure?" "I need some business advice," I said. "Completely confidential." There was a slight pause before she answered, her tone shifting to professional concern. "Of course. When would you like to meet?" "Today, if possible." The third call was to a medical patent attorney I had met through one of Eleanor's charity functions. Ironically, a woman Eleanor had dismissed as too aggressive after she'd pushed back on some of Richard's assertions during a foundation board meeting. "Sophia recommended you highly," I lied, knowing the attorney wouldn't verify this with Daniel's wife. "I need to discuss some intellectual property matters privately." By noon, I had meetings scheduled for the entire day, appointments that wouldn't appear on any calendar James or his family could access. Before leaving the townhouse, I paused in front of the large framed photo from our wedding that hung in the entryway. James and I stood surrounded by the Mitchell family, everyone dressed impeccably, smiling for the camera. I studied my own face in the photo, hopeful, a little uncertain, eager to please. "I'm sorry," I whispered to that younger version of myself, "but I'm going to fix this." My meeting with Maya was eye-opening. When I explained that I wanted a complete analysis of my professional and intellectual property situation separate from the Mitchell assets, she didn't ask why. She simply pulled up spreadsheets and asked pointed questions about my research, independent work, and patent potential. "The research you've continued on your own," she said, scrolling through the files I'd shared from my USB drive. "This autoimmune protocol, it's groundbreaking, Rebecca. Why isn't this being developed through Mitchell Healthcare?" "It was deemed too experimental," I said, "not aligned with their current product strategy." Maya gave me a look I couldn't quite interpret. "Let's run some numbers," she said, turning to her computer. "I think you might have more options than you realize." 2 hours later, I left her office with a clear understanding of my intellectual property position and a strategy that made my heart race with equal parts fear and exhilaration. The meeting with the attorney, Diana Feldman, was equally productive. She listened carefully as I outlined my concerns about separate intellectual property and asked incisive questions about my employment agreement with Mitchell Healthcare and commingled research. "The Mitchells would have had you sign an IP agreement," she said, making notes on a legal pad. "They did," I confirmed. "It primarily covers work done using company resources and during company hours, but not necessarily independent research. Conducted on your own time using your own resources," she said, tapping her pen thoughtfully, "especially if the line of inquiry was officially abandoned by the company." By the time I met Dr. Alex Winters for our video call, I had the outline of a plan that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. Alex looked exactly as I remembered, prematurely gray, perpetually enthusiastic, with an intensity that had always made him excellent at his job. His face lit up when our connection stabilized. "Rebecca, it's been too long. You look different somehow." I smiled, genuinely touched by his observation. "I feel different. More like my old self, actually." After we exchanged pleasantries, he leaned forward. "So, tell me what prompted this sudden interest in revisiting your protocol. I was beginning to think the Mitchells had permanently redirected your research focus." The comment was playful, but it hit closer to home than he could know. I took a deep breath, choosing my next words carefully. "What can you tell me about Cascadia Grove Resort in the San Juan Islands?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting that you ask. It's one of the properties we've been monitoring. Relatively new, stunning location, exceptional wellness facilities, currently owned by Oceanic Wellness Group." "Why do you ask?" I met his gaze directly through the screen. "What if I told you I want to establish a research center for integrative autoimmune treatment there?" Alex sat back in his chair, his expression shifting from curiosity to careful assessment. Rebecca, establishing a medical research center isn't like setting up a lab at the university. We're talking about an investment in the millions, regulatory hurdles, staffing. I'm aware, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Are the Mitchells looking to expand their research division to the West Coast? Because if so, this is a conversation you should be having with... This isn't about the Mitchells, I interrupted, surprised by the firmness in my tone. This would be my research, mine alone. He studied me for a long moment before responding. Okay. Let's say we're having a hypothetical conversation about you personally establishing a research center. What's your angle here, Rebecca? Because the woman I knew at Johns Hopkins was brilliant, but methodical. This is not methodical. Our conversation was interrupted briefly as his assistant brought him coffee, giving me a moment to consider my response. When we were alone again, I leaned forward slightly. What if I told you I've been reconsidering my role in the Mitchell enterprise? That I'm exploring opportunities that would be exclusively mine? Alex nodded slowly. I'd say it's about time. He took a sip of his coffee, then added, but I'd still question why you'd start with a facility of this magnitude. I hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Alex had always been straightforward with me, even when we disagreed on research approaches. If I wanted his help, I needed to offer at least some truth. The Mitchell family is planning their annual retreat at Cascadia Grove 2 weeks from now. Understanding flickered in his eyes. And you want to what? Surprise them by being the director of a new research facility when they arrive? Put so bluntly, it sounded absurd, childish even. But there was more to it than mere shock value. I want to make a statement, I said, carefully. But I also want to establish something meaningful. If the location offers the right environment for wellness-focused research, it could be the perfect base for the protocol I've been developing. Alex set down his coffee mug. Let me be clear. You want to secretly establish a research center at the resort where your in-laws are planning their vacation, reveal yourself as the director when they arrive, and somehow have this be scientifically and financially sound? When he put it that way, doubt crept in. Was I being impulsive, driven by hurt rather than logic? Was I proposing to risk my professional reputation for a moment of satisfaction? I know how it sounds, I admitted. Actually, he said, reaching for his tablet and pulling up a document, it sounds like something I'd support. A smile spread across his face as he tapped the screen. And you're in luck, because I happen to have some insider information on Cascadia Grove. He turned the tablet toward the camera, displaying what appeared to be architectural plans and a business proposal. Oceanic Wellness Group has been looking for a research partner to establish an integrative medicine center on their property. They've been in talks with several entities, but nothing has materialized. The concept is sound, but they need someone with the right research background and vision. My medical mind was already identifying possibilities. The location would be perfect for studying environmental factors in autoimmune responses. The marine air, the isolation from urban pollutants. Alex nodded approvingly. Exactly. And with the right research protocol, say an innovative approach to non-invasive autoimmune treatment, they might be very interested in accelerating their timeline. How accelerated are we talking about? I asked, a plan forming more clearly now. With the right proposal and funding structure, very. No public RFP, invitation-only consideration. How quiet? I pressed. Very. Oceanic is looking for prestigious but discreet medical partnerships. They don't want to alarm their luxury clientele with the idea that they're experimental subjects. I have capital, I said, thinking of my untouched speaking fees from medical conferences and royalties from early research patents filed before I joined the Mitchell family. Not enough to fund it outright, but enough for a substantial proposal development. As for expertise, I gestured between us on the screen. That's where partnerships come in. Alex leaned back, studying me with newfound respect. You're serious about this? Completely. He tapped his fingers on his desk, thinking. Integrated Wellness Properties might be interested in a co-development scenario. We provide facility access and operational support. You bring the research protocol. We both benefit from the outcomes. Would I have research autonomy? I asked. Full directorial authority? For that, you'd need institutional backing, either academic or corporate. I thought of the employment contract I had signed with Mitchell Healthcare, the careful divisions they had always maintained between company intellectual property and my academic interests. They had created these boundaries to protect their assets, never imagining I might someday use the same structures for my own purposes. What if I could secure additional backing? I asked. Academic sponsorship, not from the Mitchells. Alex raised an eyebrow. If you had legitimate institutional affiliation and a solid research protocol, it could work. But Rebecca, this would have to happen quickly and discreetly if you want it operational before the Mitchells arrive. They won't find out, I said, with a confidence I was beginning to genuinely feel. James and his family are completely focused on their succession planning. They won't be paying attention to a research establishment halfway across the country. And when they eventually find out, what then? It was the question I had been asking myself all day. What did I actually want from this? Revenge? Recognition? Or something else entirely? Then I'll have made my point, I said. And more importantly, I'll have established my research independently of them. He considered this, then pulled out his phone. Let me make a call. If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. As Alex stepped away from the camera to make his call, I sat alone at my desk, facing the clearest crossroads of my life. To my left lay the path I had been following for 8 years, continuing to accommodate the Mitchells, accepting my place on the periphery of their world, maintaining the appearance of a perfect marriage while my sense of self slowly eroded. To my right was a path of risk and uncertainty, but also of potential liberation. No more seeking approval that would never truly come. No more compromising my research for conditional acceptance. When Alex returned, his expression was serious but excited. My contact at Oceanic is interested. They're sending over preliminary facility specifications tonight. We can review them together. How quickly could this happen? I asked. If, and this is a big if. Everything checks out and we can secure institutional backing and expedite the necessary permits. We could potentially have a preliminary research center established within 2 weeks. He sat down, leaning forward intently. Rebecca, this is moving from hypothetical to very real. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? In that moment, I thought of James dismissing my concerns about the family trip. I thought of Eleanor's years of subtle exclusion. I thought of all the times I had dimmed my own scientific light to avoid overshadowing the Mitchell family narrative. Yes, I said, feeling the weight of the decision and embracing it fully. I'm certain. Alex nodded once, decisively. Then, let's get to work. As we bent our heads together over facility specifications and research protocols, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of pursuing genuine medical innovation, of making decisions based on scientific merit rather than someone else's expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. James had texted twice during my meetings. I hadn't replied. For the first time since our marriage, the Mitchell timeline was not my priority. I had chosen my path, and there would be no turning back. The next morning, I woke before James. Something I rarely did. Usually, he was up at 5:30, hitting the home gym before showering and heading to the office. Today, I slipped out of bed at 5, dressed quietly in running clothes, and left the townhouse before he stirred. Instead of running, I took a car to a coffee shop several neighborhoods away, where I'd arranged to meet Maya and Alex to review our strategy. By the time James would be ordering his protein shake from our housekeeper, I was reviewing partnership documents and signing confidentiality agreements. Johns Hopkins is cautiously interested, Maya said, sliding a folder across the table. Your previous affiliation opens doors, and they're intrigued by the possibility of establishing a West Coast research presence with minimal initial investment. I reviewed the preliminary affiliation agreement. Even with Hopkins' institutional backing, the amount of personal investment required was significant, far beyond what most researchers could manage alone. How are we structuring the research governance? I asked. Alex outlined a complex arrangement involving my protocol as the intellectual cornerstone, Hopkins providing academic legitimacy, and integrated wellness properties handling the facility logistics. The resulting structure would give me research directorship, with sufficient autonomy to pursue my scientific vision, while benefiting from institutional support. You'll be the principal investigator on paper, Maya explained, with full protocol authority. Hopkins will provide oversight and publication pathways, and Integrated Wellness will manage the facility integration with Cascadia Grove. And the Mitchells won't see this coming, Alex added with a slight smile. We've structured the external communications to emphasize the Johns Hopkins affiliation. Your name will appear in the scientific documentation, but won't be highlighted in any public announcements until after the formal opening. I raised an eyebrow at the careful planning. How soon can we establish a functional lab? If the permitting expedites as promised and the equipment arrives on schedule, we could have a basic research infrastructure in place 3 days before the Mitchell family is scheduled to arrive, Maya said, checking her calendar. It will be preliminary, not fully operational, but presentable. We'll need to manage expectations about immediate research capabilities. I nodded, signing the preliminary agreement with a steady hand. Let's make it happen. When I returned to the townhouse, James was in the kitchen frowning at his phone. He looked up when I entered, surprise evident on his face. Where were you? I was worried. Running, I said simply, gesturing at my attire. Thought I'd try a new route this morning. His frown deepened slightly. You didn't answer my text last night. Sorry about that. Dinner with an old colleague ran late, and I was exhausted when I got home. I poured myself a cup of coffee, keeping my movements casual. How was your day? James launched into a detailed account of his meetings, seemingly satisfied by my explanation. As he talked, I made appropriate noises of interest while my mind calculated timelines and contingencies for the research center establishment. Mom called this morning, he said, interrupting my thoughts. She wants to know if you can join her for lunch today to discuss the Cambridge facility data. I took a slow sip of coffee, considering my response. The old Rebecca would have immediately rearranged her schedule to accommodate Eleanor. The new Rebecca had priorities of her own. I can't today, I said, my tone pleasant but firm. I have appointments. James looked startled. What appointments? Personal ones, I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I can meet with her tomorrow afternoon if that works. He stared at me for a moment, clearly unused to me declining Mitchell family requests. I'll let her know, he said finally, but she won't be happy. I shrugged slightly. It's just a day's delay. The data analysis won't fall apart in 24 hours. James's phone buzzed with an incoming call, saving him from having to respond. He glanced at the screen. It's Dad. I need to take this. He stepped out onto the balcony, already switching into business mode. Over the next 5 days, I executed my plan with meticulous care. While James believed I was consulting on a short-term medical journal review, a convenient explanation for my sudden busy schedule, I was actually orchestrating the establishment of the Kendall Autoimmune Research Center at Cascadia Grove. I met with Eleanor about the Cambridge facility data. listening attentively as she detailed her expectations for the analysis. "The inconsistencies need to be identified and rationalized," she instructed, sliding a folder of trial reports across the table. "I've highlighted the anomalous results that require particular attention. No ambiguities, Rebecca. The investor presentation depends on clean data interpretation." "Of course," I agreed, accepting the folder with a smile. "I'll make sure everything is analyzed rigorously." She seemed pleased with my acquiescence, patting my hand in that condescending way she had perfected. "I knew we could count on you, dear. While we're having our little family strategy sessions, you'll be making yourself useful. That's what matters, isn't it?" "Absolutely," I said, maintaining my pleasant expression while thinking of the conference call I had scheduled in 2 hours with the Johns Hopkins Ethics Committee to review my research protocol. When James asked about my meetings, I gave vague but plausible answers about journal peer reviews and medical consultations. "I'm trying to keep busy," I explained, "since I won't be joining you in the San Juan Islands. I thought I'd focus on some professional development." He seemed relieved by my apparent acceptance of the situation. "That's my girl," he said approvingly, "always making the best of things." I didn't correct his assumption. Let him believe. I was being the compliant wife he expected. The reality would become clear soon enough. 3 days before the Mitchells were scheduled to depart, I received the call I had been waiting for. Maya's voice was triumphant. "It's done. The final permits were approved an hour ago. Congratulations, Dr. Kendall. You're officially the research director of the newest integrative medicine facility in the Pacific Northwest." A wave of exhilaration washed over me. "Has the Cascadia Grove management been notified?" "Yes, and they're thrilled. The executive director sees this as a prestige enhancement for their wellness program. The research center has its own dedicated building on the northern edge of the property, private enough for serious work, but integrated enough for proper patient interaction." "Excellent. And the Mitchell reservation?" "Still confirmed for the Cascade Suite as requested. The family has no idea about the research center establishment. The resort is treating it as a soft opening, with minimal publicity until after your arrival." That evening, as James packed for the trip, I sat on our bed watching him methodically organize his luggage. "Are you sure you'll be all right while we're gone?" he asked, folding an expensive shirt with practiced precision. 2 weeks is a long time." "I'll manage," I said mildly. "I'm actually looking forward to some time to myself." He glanced at me, perhaps catching something different in my tone. "Is everything okay, Becca? You've seemed distracted lately." I met his gaze with a calm smile. "Everything is exactly as it should be." James studied me for a moment longer before returning to his packing, dismissing whatever concern had briefly surfaced. "I've arranged for the data analysis team to check in with you daily about the Cambridge results, and Gabriella will email you updates about the regulatory submissions, just to keep you in the loop." "That's thoughtful," I said, mentally calculating the time difference between Boston and the San Juan Islands. By the time they arrived at Cascadia Grove, the wheels of my plan would already be in motion. As I watched my husband methodically prepare for a family vacation I had been excluded from, I felt strangely detached from the hurt that had initially driven my actions. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my own scientific agency, about proving to myself, not to them, that I was capable of more than they had ever allowed me to be. James closed his suitcase and turned to me. "I'll miss you," he said, sounding almost surprised by the admission. I smiled, but didn't say what he expected to hear. Instead, I replied, "The San Juan Islands will be an experience you won't forget." And for once, I was certain I was right. The morning the Mitchells departed for the San Juan Islands, I drove James to the private airfield where the family jet waited. The entire clan was there, luggage being loaded by efficient staff while Richard checked his watch impatiently. "Right on time," I said as we pulled up beside the other luxury vehicles. James squeezed my hand before opening his door. "I'll call when we land." I nodded, remaining in the driver's seat as he retrieved his bags from the trunk. Through the windshield, I watched Eleanor's face light up at the sight of her son, then dim slightly when she spotted me in the car. She said something to Olivia, who glanced my way with poorly concealed curiosity. James returned to my window. "Sure you don't want to come say goodbye to everyone?" I smiled, knowing this would be the last time I played the role they'd assigned me. "I think it's best if I don't delay your departure. Have a wonderful trip." He leaned in for a quick kiss, then joined his family without looking back. I waited until they had all boarded before driving away, the image of the gleaming jet growing smaller in my rearview mirror. Instead of returning to the townhouse, I directed my car toward the airport. The commercial flight I had booked to Seattle departed in 3 hours, just enough time to collect my own carefully packed suitcase from home and make it through security. As I drove, my phone rang. Maya's name flashed on the screen. "They're airborne," she said without preamble. "Their flight plan has them arriving at 3:45 Pacific time. The research center's final equipment installation will be complete by noon tomorrow." Any unexpected issues? Nothing significant. The MRI calibration took longer than anticipated, but it's functioning within parameters now. The lab team has arrived and is setting up the basic protocols. Dr. Nelson from Hopkins will be there tonight to oversee the final preparations. "And my office?" Maya laughed. "Set up exactly as requested. Full view of the water, research library stocked, and your name on the door. Dr. Rebecca Kendall, research director, has a nice ring to it." The sound of my maiden name, my professional name, sent a thrill through me. "I'll be there tonight. Make sure the team knows to maintain confidentiality until after the formal introduction tomorrow." After stopping briefly at the townhouse to collect my luggage, I headed to Logan International. My suitcase contained not the resort wear one might expect for a Pacific Northwest vacation, but the trappings of my reclaimed professional identity. Lab coats with my name embroidered above the pocket, research journals containing my notes, copies of my publications, and most significantly, a leather portfolio containing the complete autoimmune protocol that the Mitchells had dismissed as impractical. The flight to Seattle was just over 6 hours. 6 hours of reflecting on the path that had led me here. I reviewed research notes, made annotations to the protocol, and sketched out potential clinical trial designs. For the first time in years, I wasn't preparing for a Mitchell healthcare presentation or analyzing data to support someone else's vision. I was creating something uniquely mine. In Seattle, a car was waiting to take me to the ferry terminal. As the vehicle wound through the city's streets, my phone buzzed with a text from James. "Landed safely. Resort is even more amazing than the brochures. The family's settled in. Dad's already talking business. Miss you." I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I watched the Seattle skyline recede as we approached the ferry that would take me to the San Juan Islands. When we boarded the massive vessel, I stepped out of the car to stand at the railing, watching the water churn beneath us. Only then did I type a response. "Glad you arrived safely. Enjoy your family time." The ferry journey took nearly 2 hours, cutting through pristine waters with forested islands rising on either side. In the distance, I could occasionally glimpse the snow-capped Olympic mountains. The natural beauty was breathtaking, but my mind was focused on what awaited me. As the ferry approached Friday Harbor, I returned to my car. From there, it was a 30-minute drive to Cascadia Grove Resort. The resort appeared gradually, revealing itself through ancient cedars and firs that lined the winding approach. Unlike many luxury properties that announce themselves with ostentatious signage and grand entrances, Cascadia Grove seemed to emerge organically from its surroundings. The main lodge, a stunning structure of stone and timber, looked as though it had grown from the very cliff on which it perched. I bypassed the main entrance, following Maya's instructions to a discreet side road marked Staff and Wellness Professionals Only. This led to the northern section of the property, where the new research center had been established. The Kendall Autoimmune Research Center occupied what had previously been planned as an expansion of the resort's wellness facilities. The building, a masterpiece of contemporary Pacific Northwest architecture with massive windows framing water views, stood apart from the main resort amenities, providing the privacy needed for serious research while maintaining the aesthetic harmony of the property. Alex was waiting outside when I arrived, his face breaking into a wide smile as I stepped from the car. "The prodigal researcher returns," he said, embracing me. "It's good to see you in this context again, Rebecca." "It feels right," I admitted, looking up at the building that now bore my name on a discreet but elegant sign. He followed my gaze. "Quite a step up from your lab at Hopkins." "And light years from the windowless research space at Mitchell Healthcare," I added. Inside, the center hummed with the quiet efficiency of a research facility preparing for operation. Lab technicians calibrated equipment, administrative staff, organized files, and in the conference room, I could see Maya deep in conversation with a distinguished-looking man I recognized as Dr. Nelson from Johns Hopkins. "We've kept your arrival low-key," Alex explained as we walked through the spaces. "The resort staff know only that Johns Hopkins has established a research partnership with Cascadia Grove, with you as the director. The timing, in relation to the Mitchell family's arrival, has been treated as purely coincidental." I nodded, appreciatively. "And the research team?" "They know you previously worked with Mitchell Healthcare, but not the personal connection. Most assume you're just another researcher who got tired of corporate limitations on innovative thinking." Maya spotted us through the conference room window and excused herself to join us. "Perfect timing," she said. "Dr. Nelson was just reviewing the institutional oversight framework. He's impressed with your protocol design." "The facilities exceeded my expectations," I said, taking in the state-of-the-art equipment that surrounded. "Wait until you see your office," Maya replied with a knowing smile. "It's at the end of the hall." The office they led me to was everything a research director could want, spacious yet functional, with one wall entirely of glass overlooking the water. Bookshelves held medical references, journals, and research compendiums. A large desk faced the view, with a smaller conference table in the corner for team meetings. But what caught my eye was what hung on the wall opposite the desk: framed copies of my publications, my medical degrees, and most prominently, the initial research proposal for my autoimmune protocol that Mitchell Healthcare had rejected, presented as a historical document marking the beginning of important work. "Maya found it in your old files," Alex explained, watching my reaction. "We thought it belonged here." I ran my fingers over the frame, remembering the day Richard had handed it back to me with a patronizing smile and a comment about keeping academic interests as hobbies. Now it hung as a testament to persistence and vision. "It's perfect," I said quietly. "There's one more thing," Maya said, handing me a small box. Inside was a name badge similar to those worn by the research staff, but with a significant difference. Where theirs showed the Johns Hopkins logo alongside Cascadia Grove's, mine featured a third emblem, Kendall Research Initiative. "We registered it last week," Alex explained. "It's your independent research entity, officially partnered with Hopkins and Integrated Wellness Properties, but ultimately governed by your scientific direction." I clipped the badge to my lapel, the weight of it insignificant yet somehow profoundly important. "Now," Maya said, checking her watch, "we have about 16 hours before the Mitchells realize you're here. What's your plan for the grand revelation?" I smiled, moving to the desk where I set down my suitcase. "First, let's review where we stand with the research infrastructure. Then we'll discuss the specific arrangements for tomorrow's introduction." For the next several hours, we immersed ourselves in the details of establishing a functioning research center. Dr. Nelson walked me through the Hopkins oversight mechanisms, emphasizing the unusual degree of autonomy I'd been granted. Alex detailed the integration with the resort's wellness program, which would provide a steady stream of willing research participants. Maya presented the financial framework, which carefully balanced institutional support with my independent control. By the time we finished, it was well past midnight. The others departed for their accommodations, but I remained in my office, standing at the window watching moonlight silvering the water below. My phone, which I had deliberately ignored during our meetings, showed several missed calls from James, along with a progression of increasingly concerned text messages. "How's the data analysis going? Mom's asking if you found anything in the Cambridge results." "Becca, why aren't you answering? Everything okay?" Called the house line and got no answer. "Where are you?" The final message had come just 30 minutes earlier. "Seriously?" "Worried now. Please let me know you're all right." I considered leaving him in suspense, but that felt needlessly cruel. This wasn't about punishing James. It was about asserting my own value. I typed a brief response. "I'm fine. Working late. We'll explain everything tomorrow." His reply came almost instantly. "Thank God. Was about to call hospitals. What do you mean, explain tomorrow?" I didn't elaborate further, simply sending, "Get some sleep, James. Tomorrow will be illuminating." Then I silenced my phone, opened my suitcase, and began arranging the contents in my new office. The lab coats went into the small closet by the door. Research journals found homes on the shelves. The leather portfolio containing my complete protocol took pride of place on the desk. From a side pocket, I removed a small frame, one personal item among the professional paraphernalia. It contained a photograph of me from my Hopkins days, standing proudly beside the university's historic dome, my face alight with the possibilities that lay before me. I placed it on the desk, a reminder of who I had been and who I was reclaiming. I spent the night in the small but comfortable sleeping room attached to the research center, a space designed for researchers working late or monitoring time-sensitive experiments. Though the bed was unfamiliar, I slept more peacefully than I had in years, unburdened by the constant effort of meeting Mitchell expectations. Morning arrived with spectacular clarity, sunlight streaming through windows that faced the eastern water. I showered in the adjoining bathroom, then dressed with deliberate care in a tailored charcoal suit and ivory blouse, professional without being severe. My hair, usually styled in the soft waves Eleanor deemed appropriate for a Mitchell wife, was pulled back in a sleek chignon that emphasized the clean lines of my face. At precisely 8 a.m., the research team gathered for their first official meeting. 20 brilliant minds, researchers, technicians, and support staff, assembled in the conference room, their expressions ranging from curious to excited. "Good morning," I began, standing at the head of the table with a confidence I hadn't felt in years. "I'm Dr. Rebecca Kendall, and today marks the official commencement of the Kendall Autoimmune Research Initiative. For the next hour, I outlined our research objectives, methodological approaches, and expected timelines. The team asked insightful questions, offered valuable suggestions, and demonstrated exactly why they had been selected for this groundbreaking work. By 10 a.m., everyone had dispersed to their respective stations, beginning the careful setup of experimental protocols that would characterize our initial phase. Alex and Maya joined me in my office for a final review of the day's most significant event. The Mitchell family is scheduled for a tour of the resort's wellness facilities at 11:30, Maya confirmed, checking her tablet. They'll be brought to the research center as the exciting new addition to Cascadia Grove's health offerings. The resort director will make the introductions, Alex added. He knows only that you're the distinguished research director from Johns Hopkins establishing an innovative program here. I nodded, checking my appearance one last time in the small mirror by the door. And they have no idea? None, Maya assured me. James has been calling your cell phone every 20 minutes since dawn, but the resort staff have no knowledge of any connection between you and the Mitchell family. Alex squeezed my shoulder encouragingly. Are you ready for this? I took a deep breath, centering myself. More than ready. At precisely 11:35 a.m., my office phone rang. The center's receptionist's voice came through clearly. Dr. Kendall, the resort director has arrived with a group of VIP guests for the introductory tour. They're in the main lobby. Thank you, Jennifer. Please tell them I'll be right there. I stood, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from my suit. Maya handed me the leather portfolio containing my research protocol, a prop that would soon become the centerpiece of a dramatic revelation. The three of us walked together down the corridor toward the lobby. Through the glass doors, I could see them. Richard and Eleanor at the front, nodding politely as the resort director gestured enthusiastically toward the state-of-the-art facilities visible through interior windows. Olivia and Thomas stood behind them, looking somewhat bored. Daniel and Sophia whispered to each other, pointing at something in the lab, and James, slightly apart from the others, was checking his phone with a worried expression, presumably trying to reach me yet again. Ready? Alex whispered as we reached the doors. Absolutely, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The doors opened automatically as we approached. The resort director turned at the sound, his face lighting up. Ah, perfect timing. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to the director of our new research partnership with Johns Hopkins Medicine. Dr. Rebecca Kendall is a distinguished researcher specializing in innovative approaches to autoimmune disorders. The moment of recognition played across their faces in sequence. Confusion, disbelief, shock. James's head snapped up from his phone, his expression transforming from worry to utter bewilderment. Becca, he said, his voice barely audible. Hello, everyone, I said, stepping forward with professional composure. Welcome to the Kendall Autoimmune Research Center. We're very pleased to have Mitchell healthcare representatives tour our new facility. Eleanor recovered first, years of social training enabling her to mask her shock with a brittle smile. Rebecca, what an unexpected surprise. We had no idea you were involved with this project. Yes, Richard added, his business instincts engaging despite his evident confusion. This is quite the coincidence. Not coincidence, I corrected gently. Strategic timing. James moved toward me, his expression a mixture of confusion and something that might have been admiration. Becca, what is this? How are you here? I've been trying to reach you. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office, I suggested, maintaining my professional demeanor. Maya, Alex, would you mind showing the others around the facility? I'm sure they'd be interested in our research capabilities. Maya nodded, stepping smoothly into the role of tour guide. We'd be delighted. The Mitchell healthcare representatives might be particularly interested in our integrated diagnostic technologies. As Maya led the still-stunned Mitchell family toward the laboratory wing, with Alex providing technical explanations, I guided James toward my office. He followed in speechless confusion, his eyes darting from the research center's sophisticated equipment to my confident stance. So different from the accommodating wife he'd left in Boston. Once inside my office, I closed the door and moved. Behind my desk, assuming the position of authority in this space that was unmistakably mine. Sit down, James, I said, gesturing to one of the chairs opposite the desk. He remained standing, staring at the framed credentials on the wall, the name badge on my lapel, the photograph of my younger self. What is all this? He finally asked. When did you? I don't understand. Clearly, I replied, my voice gentle but firm. What you're seeing is the Kendall Autoimmune Research Initiative, a partnership between Johns Hopkins Medicine, Integrated Wellness Properties, and my independent research entity. We've established this center to pursue the autoimmune protocol that Mitchell Healthcare deemed too experimental 2 years ago. James sank slowly into the chair, his eyes never leaving my face. You planned this, he said, realization dawning. When I told you about the family retreat. It was the catalyst, I acknowledged. But this has been building for much longer than that, James. Years of having my research sidelined, my expertise undervalued, my contributions minimized, all while being expected to support the Mitchell vision without question. But why the secrecy? Why not tell me what you were planning? I raised an eyebrow. Like you told me about the decision to exclude me from the family retreat? Or how your mother consistently undermined my research proposals? Or how your father rerouted my innovations through Mitchell healthcare channels, removing my name from the development credits? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's business, Becca. It's how things work in corporate research. No, I said firmly. That's the Mitchell way of doing business. There are other models that value intellectual contribution and innovation over family hierarchy. James glanced around the office, taking in the impressive view, the sophisticated technology visible through the interior windows, the clear evidence of institutional backing. Hopkins is funding this? He asked, his business mind engaging despite his personal shock. Hopkins is providing institutional oversight and academic affiliation, I corrected. The funding is a partnership structure with integrated wellness, properties, and private investment. Private investment? His eyes narrowed slightly. What private investment? Mine, I said simply. My speaking fees from medical conferences, royalties from my pre-Mitchell publications, and consulting income I've been setting aside. I didn't know you had consulting income, he said slowly. There's a lot you didn't know, James. Or perhaps didn't want to know. He stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the water. So this is... what? Revenge for being excluded from a family meeting? Proving you don't need the Mitchell name or resources? I joined him at the window, maintaining a professional distance. This isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming my professional identity and pursuing research I believe in. Research that could help thousands of autoimmune patients if given the proper support and development. And the timing? He asked, turning to face me. Establishing this at the exact location of our family retreat, unveiling it while we're here. That's not meant as a statement? The timing is deliberate, I acknowledged. But the statement isn't what you think. I'm not trying to embarrass your family or undermine Mitchell Healthcare. I'm demonstrating that I am more than an extension of your professional identity, that my work has value on its own terms. James studied my face, seeming to truly see me for perhaps the first time. In years. You've changed, he said quietly. No, I corrected. I've remembered who I was always meant to be. A knock at the door interrupted us. Maya poked her head in, her expression professionally neutral despite the undercurrent of tension she surely sensed. Dr. Kendall, the Mitchell family has completed the tour of the laboratory facilities. They're waiting in the conference room as you requested. Thank you, Maya. Please tell them I'll join them shortly. After she left, James and I regarded each other in silence for a moment. What happens now? He finally asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Now, I said, picking up my leather portfolio. I give your family a detailed presentation on the autoimmune protocol that will be the centerpiece of this research center, and then we all decide how to move forward, as professionals and perhaps as family, on very different terms than before. As we walked together toward the conference room, James asked one more question, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Are you leaving me? I paused, turning to face him fully. I've left the version of myself that existed solely to support your ambitions. Whether that means leaving our marriage depends entirely on whether you can accept a wife who is also a research director with her own professional identity and autonomous goals. His expression reflected genuine conflict. I don't know how to separate those parts of my life. The Mitchell legacy has always been about family continuity and business. I'm not asking you to abandon your legacy, I clarified. I'm asking if there's room in it for a wife who has scientific ambitions and capabilities of her own. A wife who won't always prioritize Mitchell interests above her own research. And if there isn't room? He asked, the question hanging between us. Then we have some difficult decisions ahead, I replied simply. We continued to the conference room in silence, both aware that the conversation we'd just had marked a fundamental shift in our relationship, a recalibration that couldn't be undone regardless of what happened next. The Mitchell family waited, around the conference table, their expressions a study in controlled reactions. Richard sat at one end, his posture rigid, clearly having appointed himself chairman of this unexpected meeting. Eleanor beside him maintained a neutral expression. That belied the calculation I could see in her eyes. Olivia and Daniel flanked their parents, while their spouses sat slightly apart, as if physically representing their perpetual outsider status in family matters. As James and I entered, all eyes turned to us. I moved confidently to the head of the table, the position Richard had deliberately not taken, unwilling to cede control even in a space that wasn't his. Thank you all for your patience, I began, placing my portfolio on the table and remaining standing. I imagine you have questions about what you've seen today. Let me be perfectly clear, Richard said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had closed countless business deals. Whatever this, he gestured around the research center, is meant to accomplish, it doesn't change the fact that you have responsibilities to Mitchell Healthcare. I met his gaze steadily. Actually, Richard, my contractual obligations to Mitchell Healthcare are quite limited. As you'll recall, you specifically structured my employment agreement to minimize the company's commitment to my research pathways. That same structure gives me considerable freedom to pursue independent projects. I opened the leather portfolio and removed a document, sliding it across the table. This is a copy of my employment agreement, with the relevant sections highlighted. You'll note paragraph 4. 3 specifically states that research conducted on my own time, using non-company resources, remains my intellectual property. Richard didn't reach for the document. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of his surprise that I had so thoroughly understood the legal framework he had designed to protect the company from me, rather than the other way around. Eleanor, who had remained unnaturally quiet, finally spoke. This is highly inappropriate, Rebecca. Whatever grievances you think you have, this public display is beneath the standards we expect from family. I tilted my head slightly. Public? This is a private research facility, and we're having a closed-door conversation. The only people aware of our connection are in this room. You know what I mean? She snapped, her composure slipping. Ambushing us during a family retreat? Creating this elaborate charade. It's theatrical and unnecessary. I disagree, I replied calmly. My previous attempts to discuss these issues within conventional family channels were consistently dismissed or redirected. This approach ensured I would have your full attention. Olivia, who had been studying me with unexpected intensity, leaned forward. I have to say, Rebecca, I never thought you had something like this in you. 8 years of playing the perfect Mitchell wife, and suddenly you're running your own research center? It's impressive. Thank you, I said, genuinely appreciating her candor. Though I would argue the research director was always there, just waiting for the right opportunity. Daniel, ever the pragmatist of the Mitchell siblings, cleared his throat. Let's cut to the practical implications. Are you planning to compete directly with Mitchell Healthcare? Because that would create significant conflicts of interest, not to mention potential legal issues. The Kendall Initiative focuses on autoimmune protocol development, an area Mitchell Healthcare explicitly decided not to pursue, I explained. There's no direct competition. In fact, there could be complementary opportunities if the company were open to collaboration. Richard made a dismissive sound. Collaboration? After this stunt? This isn't a stunt, I corrected. It's a legitimate research center with institutional backing and a clear scientific mission. The fact that you immediately frame it as a personal affront rather than a professional development says more about your perspective than mine. James, who had remained silent since we entered the room, finally spoke. Dad, she's right. The protocol Rebecca is pursuing has merit. We chose not to prioritize it for business reasons, not scientific ones. All eyes turned to him, surprise evident on several faces. James had rarely contradicted his father in professional matters, particularly in family settings. You knew about this? Richard demanded. No, James admitted, glancing at me. But I knew about the protocol. I've read her research. It's potentially groundbreaking, but our business model doesn't accommodate long-term therapeutic development without immediate commercial applications. Eleanor's perfectly manicured nails tapped a sharp rhythm on the conference table. James, surely you can't be defending this behavior. Your wife deliberately deceived you, established a competing research entity, and orchestrated this humiliating scenario. I don't feel humiliated, James replied quietly. Surprised, yes. But what's actually humiliating is realizing I've been so absorbed in Mitchell business that I didn't notice my wife building something of this magnitude right under my nose. The room fell silent as the family absorbed this unexpected response. Sophia, Daniel's wife, who had been observing with carefully neutral expression, caught my eye and gave me a nearly imperceptible nod of approval. Perhaps, Thomas, Olivia's husband, suggested cautiously, we could all benefit from understanding exactly what this research center aims to accomplish. The science itself, rather than the circumstances of its revelation. It was a reasonable suggestion, redirecting the conversation from emotional reactions to substantive matters. Thomas, an architect by training, had always been the most diplomatic of the Mitchell spouses, finding ways to diffuse tension without directly challenging family authority. An excellent suggestion, I said, opening my portfolio again. The Kendall Autoimmune Research Initiative focuses on developing non-invasive modulation protocols for autoimmune disorders. Our approach combines targeted immunotherapy with environmental influence management, essentially teaching the immune system to recognize self-markers correctly through progressive exposure protocols rather than simply suppressing immune function. I removed a series of diagrams, placing them on the table where everyone could see. These represent the initial clinical pathways we'll be investigating, beginning with rheumatoid arthritis and progressing to more complex conditions like multiple sclerosis and lupus. Despite himself, Richard leaned forward to examine the diagrams. His scientific background, often overshadowed by his business acumen, was still foundational to his understanding of the healthcare industry. The delivery mechanism? He asked, professional curiosity momentarily overriding his anger. A combination of precisely calibrated microdosing and environmental exposure regulation, I explained, indicating the relevant section of the protocol. The initial results from our pilot study, conducted independently of Mitchell Healthcare, I should add, showed a 47% reduction in inflammatory markers without the immunosuppressive side effects of conventional treatments. Daniel whistled, softly. That's significant if it holds in larger studies. We believe it will, I said. Johns Hopkins certainly thinks so, which is why they've committed institutional resources to the research. Richard's expression darkened at the mention of the prestigious institution. Hopkins could have partnered with Mitchell Healthcare directly if this protocol had merit. They could have, I agreed, but they chose to partner with me, perhaps because my approach isn't constrained by immediate profit considerations or corporate hierarchy. Eleanor stood abruptly. This has gone on long enough. We came to Cascadia Grove for a family retreat and strategic planning session. not to be manipulated into some melodramatic confrontation about Rebecca's career ambitions. "Mom," Olivia interjected, "aren't you even a little curious about how she pulled this off? Rebecca's been the quintessential team player for 8 years, and suddenly she's orchestrated a major research initiative without any of us having a clue. I think that deserves at least some professional respect." Eleanor turned a cold gaze on her daughter. "Deception isn't worthy of respect, regardless of how cleverly executed." "Is it deception?" Sophia asked quietly. All eyes turned to her, surprised by her intervention. "Or is it simply pursuing her work independently after being repeatedly told it wasn't a priority for the family business?" Daniel gave his wife a warning look, but Sophia continued, her voice growing more confident. "From what I've observed, over the years, Rebecca has consistently tried to contribute her expertise to Mitchell Healthcare, only to be sidelined or have her work attributed to others." "That's absurd," Eleanor dismissed. "She's been included in company initiatives appropriate to her background." "Appropriate to her background?" Sophia echoed. "She's a published researcher with a doctorate from one of the country's top medical programs. Yet she's been treated like an auxiliary resource rather than the scientific mind she is." I hadn't expected support from this quarter. Sophia, an art historian who had always seemed somewhat intimidated by the Mitchell family dynamics, had apparently been more observant than any of us realized. "Thank you, Sophia," I said sincerely. "But I didn't establish this research center to air grievances. I did it because I believe in the science and in my ability to advance medical understanding of autoimmune disorders." Richard stood, assuming the authoritative posture that typically preceded the conclusion of difficult business meetings. Regardless of the scientific merits, the fact remains that this situation creates complications for Mitchell Healthcare. As a family member with insider knowledge of our operations, your independent research ventures represent potential conflicts of interest. "I've anticipated that concern," I replied, removing another document from my portfolio. "This is a comprehensive conflict mitigation framework prepared by legal counsel and already approved by the Johns Hopkins Ethics Committee. It establishes clear boundaries between my work here and any proprietary Mitchell Healthcare information." I handed copies to everyone at the table. "You'll note that I've even proposed a third-party review mechanism for any research that might overlap with Mitchell areas of interest." Richard took the document but didn't look at it. "This doesn't address the fundamental issue of family loyalty." "I disagree," I said firmly. "True loyalty isn't blind obedience or self-erasure. It's contributing your best self to collective growth. I've spent 8 years trying to contribute my scientific expertise to Mitchell Healthcare, only to have it consistently undervalued. This research center allows me to make a different kind of contribution, one that could ultimately benefit the medical community far more than my continued subordination to Mitchell priorities." James, who had been quietly reviewing the conflict mitigation document, looked up. "She's thought of everything, Dad. This framework is actually more comprehensive than our standard non-compete agreements." "Of course she has," Richard said with grudging acknowledgement. "Rebecca has always been meticulous. It's what made her valuable in regulatory compliance matters." The backhanded compliment, acknowledging my capabilities while simultaneously reminding everyone of my subordinate role, was classic Richard Mitchell. 8 months ago, I would have accepted it with a gracious smile. Today, I simply waited, knowing that his next move would reveal much about how this confrontation would ultimately resolve. After a moment of tense silence, Richard turned to James. "What's your position on all this? She's your wife, after all." The question was deliberately phrased to put James in an impossible position, forcing him to choose between loyalty to his father and support for his wife. It was a tactic Richard had employed countless times in business negotiations, creating artificial binary choices to maintain control. My position, James said carefully, is that we should evaluate the situation based on its actual merits rather than emotional reactions. Rebecca has established a legitimate research center with serious institutional backing. The science shows promise. The conflict mitigation framework addresses the business concerns. He looked at me directly. What I don't understand is why this had to be revealed in such a dramatic fashion. Why not just tell me what you were planning? Would you have supported it? I asked simply. James opened his mouth to reply, then closed it again, the truth of the situation apparently dawning on him. After a moment, he admitted, I would have brought it to Dad, to the family. We would have discussed how it aligned with Mitchell priorities. Exactly, I said. And if the family decided it didn't align with Mitchell priorities, would you have supported my pursuit of it independently? His silence was answer enough. Eleanor, who had been watching this exchange with calculating eyes, suddenly changed tactics. Perhaps we're approaching this all wrong. Rebecca has obviously put considerable thought into this venture. Rather than viewing it as a challenge to Mitchell Healthcare, we might consider how it could be integrated into our broader portfolio. The abrupt pivot was jarring, but not unexpected. Eleanor had always been adept at recalibrating when direct confrontation proved ineffective. Integration? I repeated. You mean acquisition by Mitchell Healthcare? A partnership, Eleanor clarified smoothly. Your research initiative under the Mitchell Healthcare umbrella, with appropriate autonomy and recognition, of course. Richard, catching his wife's strategy, immediately nodded. It makes sense. You'd have the resources of Mitchell Healthcare behind your research while maintaining directorial control of the specific protocols. A win-win arrangement. The offer was cleverly constructed, acknowledging my achievement while simultaneously attempting to subsume it into the Mitchell empire. Once again, I would be under the family umbrella, my work ultimately advancing the Mitchell legacy rather than standing independently. That's a generous offer, I said carefully. But the Kendall Initiative was specifically designed to operate independently of corporate healthcare structures. Our research methodology requires freedom from quarterly profit expectations and shareholder considerations. All research requires funding, Richard pointed out. Johns Hopkins provides academic credibility, but their financial commitment is likely limited. Mitchell Healthcare could provide sustainable, long-term backing without the constant grant writing and fundraising that drains resources from actual scientific work. It was a compelling argument, appealing directly to the researcher in me who understood the perpetual struggle for funding. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine the possibilities. Access to Mitchell Healthcare's vast resources, sophisticated equipment, established distribution channels for eventual therapeutic applications. But then I remembered the last 8 years, how every initiative I proposed had been redirected to serve Mitchell priorities, how my contributions had been repackaged to fit the family narrative. Integration, no matter how attractively presented, would inevitably lead back to the same power dynamics. I appreciate the offer, I said finally. But the Kendall Initiative will remain independent. We've secured sufficient funding for the initial 3-year research phase, and our preliminary results should position us well for additional grants and private investment. Richard's expression hardened. Independence comes at a cost, Rebecca, not just financially, but personally. The implied threat hung in the air. If I persisted in this path, I would be choosing my research over my place in the Mitchell family, perhaps even over my marriage. Before I could respond, Sophia spoke again. Why does it have to be a choice? Why can't Rebecca pursue her independent research and still be part of the family? Unless the real issue isn't her research at all, but the fact that she's stepped outside the role you assigned her. Daniel turned to his wife, visibly surprised by her continued intervention. Sophia, this is a complicated business matter. No, she interrupted with uncharacteristic firmness. This is about control. I've watched for years as the Mitchell family welcomed spouses only to the extent that they conformed to predetermined roles. Rebecca is simply the first to challenge that arrangement directly. The room fell silent as the truth of her observation registered. Even Thomas, who had largely remained a neutral presence at family gatherings, nodded slightly in acknowledgement. James stood and moved to the window, his back to the group as he stared out at the water. When he finally turned, his expression was troubled but resolute. "Dad, Mom." Sophia's right. We've created a family culture where support means compliance, where being a Mitchell spouse means subordinating individual aspirations to the family business. He looked at me. I never saw it clearly until today. Until I walked into this research center and realized my wife had created something remarkable despite us, not because of us. Eleanor's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. That's unfair, James. We've always supported appropriate initiatives. Appropriate according to whom? He challenged. Who decides what constitutes appropriate contributions from family members? Richard, sensing the conversation slipping, beyond his control, attempted to redirect. This philosophical debate is interesting, but it doesn't address the practical reality. Rebecca has established a research center that potentially competes with Mitchell healthcare interests. We need to determine how to manage that situation. It only competes if you define Mitchell Healthcare's interests as encompassing all possible medical research, I pointed out. The autoimmune protocol I'm developing was explicitly deemed outside your strategic priorities. You can't claim competitive infringement on a direction you chose not to pursue. Olivia, who had been observing the back and forth with unusual attentiveness, suddenly laughed. "She's outmaneuvered all of us," she said, a note of reluctant admiration in her voice. Legally, scientifically, strategically, Rebecca's positioned. The Kendall Initiative in the perfect space just outside Mitchell Healthcare's claimed territory, while establishing institutional backing that gives her credibility independent of the Mitchell name. It wasn't about outmaneuvering anyone, I said. It was about creating space for meaningful work. Perhaps, Olivia acknowledged. But you have to admit, the execution was masterful. Using our family retreat as the revelation moment, ensuring we'd all be here to see your research center firsthand rather than dismissing it from a distance. That's strategic thinking worthy of a Mitchell. Except she's not using the Mitchell name, Eleanor pointed out sharply. She's deliberately established this under her maiden name. Yes, I confirmed, because this research represents my independent scientific contribution, not an extension of Mitchell Healthcare. Richard, ever the pragmatist, seemed to recognize that direct opposition would be ineffective. He shifted to a different approach. Let's be practical. What exactly are you proposing as the relationship between the Kendall Initiative and Mitchell? Healthcare moving forward? Complete separation? Some form of professional courtesy? We need to establish parameters. It was a fair question, finally acknowledging that the research center was a reality that couldn't simply be absorbed or dismissed. I propose respectful professional boundaries, I said. The Kendall Initiative will pursue its research agenda, independently. If our work yields innovations relevant to Mitchell Healthcare's product lines, we can discuss licensing or collaboration on standard industry terms, the same arrangement you'd consider with any other independent research entity. And personally? Eleanor asked, looking pointedly between James and me. What does this mean for your role in the family? It was the question that cut to the heart of the matter, one that I had been carefully considering since the moment I decided to establish the research center. That depends, I said, meeting her gaze steadily, on whether the Mitchell family can accept a member who maintains professional independence, who contributes from a position of equality rather than subordination. That's not how family businesses work, Richard said dismissively. There has to be unified direction, clear leadership. In the business, yes, I agreed. But we're not talking about Mitchell Healthcare's corporate structure. We're talking about family relationships, about whether individuals can be valued for who they are rather than how well they serve predetermined roles. James moved to stand beside me, the physical positioning itself a statement. Dad, Mom, I think what Rebecca is saying, what she's demonstrating, is that the boundaries between family and business have become unhealthy. We've allowed Mitchell Healthcare to define our personal relationships rather than the other way around. Richard studied his son with a mixture of surprise and disappointment. I never thought I'd see the day when you, of all people, would advocate for separating family from business. The Mitchell legacy has always been about the integration of the two. Maybe that's the problem, James replied quietly. Maybe some boundaries would make both the family and the business healthier. The conversation was interrupted by a discreet knock at the door. Alex entered, his expression professionally neutral, though his eyes registered the tension in the room. I apologize for the interruption, Dr. Kendall, but the Johns Hopkins Research Oversight Committee is on the line for the scheduled update call. I nodded, grateful for the timely intervention. Thank you, Dr. Winters. Please tell them I'll join the call in 5 minutes. After Alex withdrew, I turned back to the Mitchell family. As you can see, the research center is fully operational with regular institutional oversight. This isn't a personal project or a statement. It's a legitimate scientific initiative, with serious backing. I gathered my materials from the table, returning them to the portfolio. I suggest we all take some time to process this new reality. The Mitchell family retreat can continue as planned. The resort is certainly large enough for all of us to coexist comfortably. Perhaps after some reflection, we can discuss next steps in a less charged atmosphere. Richard stood, clearly unaccustomed to having meetings concluded by anyone other than himself. This conversation isn't finished, Rebecca. I agree, I said calmly, but it is paused. I have professional obligations to attend to, just as I'm sure you have your strategic planning to continue. I turned to address the entire group. You're welcome to tour the research facilities again if you're interested in the scientific aspects of our work. Dr. Winters or Dr. Rodriguez would be happy to provide more detailed explanations of the protocols. With that, I moved toward the door, outwardly composed though my heart was racing. The confrontation had unfolded differently than I had anticipated, with unexpected allies and James taking a more supportive position than I had dared hope. James followed me into the hallway, closing the conference room door behind him. For a moment, we stood in silence, the magnitude of what had just transpired hanging between us. You could have told me, he said finally, his voice low. Would you have heard me? I asked simply. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I knew well. I don't know. I want to say yes, but the evidence suggests otherwise. I finished for him. James, I tried to tell you in 100 small ways that my research mattered to me, that I needed professional autonomy, that being a Mitchell wife wasn't fulfilling my scientific potential. I thought you were happy with our life, he said, echoing his words from our townhouse conversation that now seemed a lifetime ago. Parts of it, yes. Our relationship, when it was actually about us and not about Mitchell Healthcare. The life we built together when it was truly together. I met his gaze directly. But professionally? No, I wasn't happy. I was slowly disappearing into a role that left no room for the researcher I've always been. James glanced back at the conference room door, then at the research center surrounding us. Physical evidence of the double life I had been creating while he remained oblivious. What happens now? With us, I mean. It was the question that underlay all others, the one that would ultimately determine the personal cost of my professional reclamation. That depends, I said, echoing my earlier response but with a gentler tone. On whether you can see me as I am now, not as an extension of Mitchell Healthcare or a supporting character in the family narrative, but as a researcher with her own valid path. "And if I can?" he asked, vulnerability evident in his expression. "Then we find a new way forward, one where both our work matters, where we support each other's ambitions rather than automatically prioritizing Mitchell Healthcare's interests." He nodded slowly, processing the implications of this fundamental shift in our relationship dynamic. "The separate names," he said, gesturing to my name badge with Kendall prominently displayed. "Is that symbolic, or—" "It's professional," I clarified. "My research has always been published under Kendall. It's my scientific identity. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm rejecting Mitchell personally." A subtle relief crossed his features. "So, I'm not filing for divorce, if that's what you're asking," I said quietly. "But I am establishing boundaries that haven't existed before. My work here is mine, James. Not Mitchell Healthcare's, not yours, not your family's. Mine." He studied me for a long moment, as if seeing me through new eyes. "You know what's strange? You seem more like the woman I fell in love with now than you have in years. There's a fire in you that I'd forgotten was there." The observation touched something deep within me, an acknowledgement that in reclaiming my professional self, I had also reclaimed aspects of my personal identity that had gradually been suppressed in my efforts to fit the Mitchell mold. "That fire never went out," I told him. "It just needed oxygen." A discreet cough from down the hallway reminded me of the waiting conference call. Alex stood at a respectful distance, clearly trying to balance the need for professional timeliness with sensitivity to the personal conversation. "I have to take this call," I said. "It's the oversight committee." James nodded. "Go, do your work. I need some time to think anyway." As I turned to leave, he caught my hand. "Becca, for what it's worth, what you've built here, it's extraordinary. Mitchell Healthcare or not, I'm proud of you." The simple acknowledgement, professional respect from the man who had witnessed my capabilities but allowed them to be sidelined for years, brought unexpected emotion to my throat. "Thank you," I said softly. "That means more than you know." As I walked toward my office to take the Hopkins call, leaving James to return to his family, I felt a curious lightness despite the tension of the confrontation. For the first time in years, I had spoken my truth without filtering it through the lens of Mitchell expectations. I had stood in my professional power without diminishing myself to maintain family harmony. Whatever came next, whether reconciliation with the Mitchells or permanent establishment of new boundaries, I would face it as Dr. Rebecca Kendall, Research Director of the Kendall Autoimmune Initiative, not as an extension of someone else's legacy, but as the author of my own. 1 year later, I stood on the private deck of my research center office, watching the sunrise paint the San Juan Islands in shades of amber and rose. The pristine waters reflected the golden light, creating a scene of tranquil beauty that still took my breath away even after months of witnessing it daily. The research center had transformed in the past year, just as I had transformed in claiming my independence. The Kendall Autoimmune Research Initiative had flourished beyond even my most optimistic projections. What had begun as a bold statement of professional autonomy had evolved into a groundbreaking research hub that was redefining treatment approaches for autoimmune disorders. Our first clinical trial had yielded results significant enough to warrant publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, with 2 additional studies already showing promising preliminary data. The research team, initially assembled hastily to establish credibility before the Mitchells' arrival, had coalesced into a cohesive unit of brilliant minds united by genuine scientific passion. We had expanded from the original 20 researchers to nearly 50, with applications arriving weekly from scientists eager to join what was becoming known as one of the most innovative medical research environments in the country. Most importantly, the first group of patients had begun receiving our experimental protocol, with early results indicating a 62% reduction in symptom severity without the devastating side effects of conventional immunosuppressive treatments. Real people were experiencing tangible improvements in their quality of life because of work that might never have seen the light of day under Mitchell Healthcare's commercially driven research priorities. Dr. Kendall, your 9:00 a.m. video conference is ready to begin. My assistant's voice came through the intercom, interrupting my moment of reflection. Thank you, Elise. I'll be right there. As I gathered my materials for the call, a discussion with potential research partners from the Mayo Clinic interested in adopting our protocol for a multi-center trial, I caught sight of the framed article on my wall. Scientific American had featured our work in their Breakthrough Innovations issue, highlighting the paradigm shift our approach represented in autoimmune treatment. The photo showed me in our laboratory, surrounded by my research team, my expression focused and confident as I explained a complex molecular structure on the display screen beside us. It was an image that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago, when my scientific contributions had been routinely minimized or absorbed into the Mitchell Healthcare narrative. Now, I was regularly invited to speak at international medical conferences, consulted by research institutions developing similar protocols, and approached by venture capital firms interested in the therapeutic applications of our discoveries. The past year had been one of profound professional growth, but the personal landscape had proven more complicated to navigate. The dramatic revelation of the research center had indeed forced a recalibration of my relationship with the Mitchell family, though not in the ways I might have anticipated. Richard and Eleanor had returned to Boston immediately after our confrontation, maintaining a cool distance that gradually evolved into a carefully managed professional courtesy. They had ultimately recognized that direct opposition would be counterproductive, especially after Johns Hopkins publicly announced their partnership with the Kendall Initiative. Instead, they had adopted a strategy of polite acknowledgement, treating my research center as they might any other independent entity in the medical field, with formal respect but clear boundaries. Olivia, surprisingly, had become an unexpected ally. Impressed by what she called my strategic boldness, she had visited the research center several times over the past year, genuinely interested in understanding our work. As Mitchell Healthcare's marketing director, she had even suggested potential non-competitive areas of collaboration, though these had yet to materialize into formal arrangements. Daniel remained cautious but respectful, his pragmatic business mind recognizing the potential value in maintaining cordial relations with what was becoming an influential player in autoimmune research. Sophia, who had stood up for me during that pivotal confrontation, continued to offer quiet support, occasionally sending articles or research notes she thought might interest me. And James. James had faced perhaps the most profound adjustment, forced to reconcile his loyalty to the Mitchell family legacy with his marriage to a woman who had dramatically redefined her place within it. After the initial shock and confusion, he had returned to Boston to resume his role at Mitchell Healthcare while I remained at the research center, establishing what we called our bi-coastal experiment, a period of physical separation that allowed us both to process the fundamental shift in our relationship. For the first 2 months, we had communicated primarily through carefully worded texts and occasional video calls, the strain evident in our cautious interactions. Then, unexpectedly, James had appeared at my office doorway one Friday afternoon, looking tired but determined after a cross-country flight. "I miss you," he had said simply, "not just as my wife, but as my intellectual partner. I've been thinking about what you said, about supporting each other's ambitions rather than automatically prioritizing the family business. I want to try." That weekend had marked the beginning of our new arrangement. James divided his time between Boston and the San Juan Islands, spending 10 days each month at the research center, where he had gradually carved out a unique role as our regulatory strategy advisor, a position that utilized his expertise while respecting the boundaries of my directorship. The Mitchell family had observed this development with varying degrees of acceptance. Richard viewed it as a temporary accommodation, convinced that eventually I would relocate back to Boston, or James would tire of the transcontinental commute. Eleanor maintained that a proper marriage required full-time cohabitation and frequently reminded James of pending social obligations that would benefit from his wife's presence. But as the months passed and our arrangement stabilized, a surprising thing happened. James began to flourish in ways that had been constrained within the confines of the Mitchell family dynamic. Away from his father's immediate influence, he demonstrated creative approaches to regulatory challenges that impressed even our most skeptical researchers. He developed genuine relationships with the research team based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. Most significantly, he began quietly exploring his own independent consulting practice, advising emerging biotech companies on navigational strategies for the regulatory landscape. Dr. Kendall? Elise appeared at my office door. Mayo Clinic is waiting. And Dr. Mitchell asked me to remind you about your dinner reservation tonight. I smiled at her use of our professional titles, a small but meaningful acknowledgement of our separate identities, even within our marriage. Thank you, Elise. Please tell them I'll be right there. The video conference ran longer than scheduled, the Mayo team's enthusiasm for our protocol generating detailed questions and discussions of potential collaboration frameworks. By the time we concluded, it was nearly noon, and I had just enough time to review the latest research data before my next commitment, a lunch meeting with a potential donor interested in funding an expansion of our patient treatment facilities. As I walked through the research center, I was struck by how organically it had evolved from the hastily established facility of a year ago into a thriving scientific community. The main laboratory buzzed with focused energy as researchers analyzed samples and discussed results. The conference room hosted a small group of clinicians reviewing patient data. Even the reception area had transformed, now displaying a wall of testimonials from patients whose conditions had improved under our protocol. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Landed safely. Dinner at 7 still works? Have news to share. I smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. After a year of transcontinental commuting, he still texted upon each arrival, a small gesture of connection that had become part of our new relationship rhythm. The lunch meeting with the potential donor, a tech entrepreneur whose daughter suffered from lupus, went exceptionally well. By the end of our discussion, he had committed to funding not only our proposed patient wing expansion, but also a fellowship program for young researchers specializing in autoimmune disorders. What convinced me, he explained as we walked through the current facilities, is that you've created something that bridges the gap between academic research and real-world application. Most institutions do one or the other well, but rarely both. His observation resonated with me. That balance, maintaining scientific integrity while ensuring practical therapeutic applications, had been central to my vision for the Kendall initiative. It was precisely the integration that had proven so difficult to achieve within the Mitchell healthcare framework, where commercial considerations invariably took precedence over scientific exploration. After the donor departed, I spent the afternoon in the laboratory, working directly with our research team on a promising modification to our treatment protocol. The hands-on research time had become a non-negotiable part of my schedule, ensuring that my role as director never completely separated me from the scientific work that remained my core passion. At 6:30, I returned to my office to prepare for dinner with James. As I changed from my lab coat into a simple but elegant dress, I caught sight of the small framed photograph on my desk, a candid shot of James and me from 3 months ago, standing on the deck of a ferry crossing Puget Sound, laughing as the wind tousled our hair. It captured something essential about our reconfigured relationship. Less formal, more authentic, finding joy in unexpected moments rather than scripted Mitchell family occasions. The restaurant James had selected was one of our favorites, a small bistro in Friday Harbor that served local seafood with a breathtaking view of the marina. As I arrived, I spotted him already seated at our usual table by the window, studying something on his tablet with characteristic intensity. He looked up as I approached, his face brightening in a way that still made my heart skip after nearly a decade together. "There she is, the revolutionary researcher changing the face of autoimmune treatment," he said, standing to greet me with a kiss. "Revolutionary might be overstating things," I replied, though we both knew the description wasn't far off. "How was your flight?" "Uneventful, which is all one can hope for these days." He pulled out my chair. "But the real question is, how did the Mayo Clinic call go? Are they on board?" We fell into easy conversation about the day's events, the video conference, the donor meeting, the research breakthrough we were cautiously optimistic about. In these moments, our professional lives intertwined naturally, each genuinely interested in the other's work without the competitive undercurrent that had often characterized discussions of Mitchell healthcare matters. "You mentioned you had news?" I prompted after our appetizers arrived. James set down his fork, his expression shifting to something more serious. "Dad's stepping down as CEO. The announcement wasn't entirely unexpected. Richard was approaching 70, and succession planning had been an ongoing discussion within Mitchell Healthcare for years. But the timing was surprising. When? 6 months from now. The board approved the transition plan yesterday." James took a sip of his wine. "He's recommended me as his successor." I studied his face, trying to gauge his feelings about this development. "And how do you feel about that?" "Conflicted," he admitted. "On one hand, it's what I've been groomed for my entire life. On the other, it would change our current arrangement," I finished for him. "The CEO position would demand his full-time presence in Boston, effectively ending our bi-coastal compromise." "That's part of it," he acknowledged. "But there's more." He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The past year, working with your research team, consulting independently, it's changed my perspective on what Mitchell Healthcare could be, should be." "What do you mean?" "We've become too focused on immediate commercial applications, on quarterly results that satisfy shareholders but don't necessarily advance medical care in meaningful ways." His eyes met mine directly. "Watching what you've built here, seeing the impact on actual patients, it's made me question the direction we've been heading." It was perhaps the most significant shift I'd witnessed in him, a willingness to critically examine the business philosophy that had shaped the Mitchell empire for generations. "Have you shared these thoughts with your father?" James laughed softly. "Let's just say our conversations about the future of Mitchell Healthcare have become increasingly robust." I could well imagine Richard's reaction to his son's evolving perspective. "And if you accept the CEO position, what changes would you implement?" "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about." He reached across the table, taking my hand. "I'm considering proposing a new research division within Mitchell Healthcare. One, focused on long-term therapeutic innovations rather than immediate commercial products. And I'd like your input on how to structure it." The request caught me off guard. "My input? Not my leadership?" "I know better than to ask you to abandon the Kendall initiative," he said with a smile that acknowledged how far we'd come. "But your insights on creating a research environment that balances scientific inquiry with practical applications would be invaluable." I considered his proposal carefully. A year ago, I might have seen it as an attempt to pull me back into the Mitchell orbit, to reclaim some control over my professional activities. Now, I recognized it for what it was, a genuine request for expertise from one professional to another. "I'd be happy to consult on the structure," I said finally. "But James, are you certain this is the direction you want to take? Richard has very specific ideas about Mitchell Healthcare's identity." "That's the thing about succession," he replied. "It's not about maintaining the exact same course. It's about respecting the foundation while steering toward a future that reflects new realities." He squeezed my hand, Dad built an incredible company, but the healthcare landscape has changed, and Mitchell Healthcare needs to evolve with it. Over dessert, our conversation shifted to the practical implications of James potentially becoming CEO. We discussed various scenarios for maintaining our marriage while honoring our separate professional paths, perhaps a more balanced division of time between Boston and the San Juan Islands, or even a third location that could serve as neutral territory. "What about children?" James asked unexpectedly as we finished our coffee. "We've put that conversation on hold for years, first because of Mitchell Healthcare priorities, then because of our complicated living arrangement. But is it something you still want to consider?" The question touched on a deeply personal aspect of our relationship that had been overshadowed by professional considerations for too long. Eleanor's insistence that pregnancy would be inconvenient for James's career trajectory had effectively silenced my maternal instincts, relegating them to some indefinite future that never seemed to arrive. "I do," I admitted, "though I'm not sure how it would work with our current arrangement." "People make more complicated situations work every day," James pointed out. "And unlike in the past, any decisions would be ours, not subject to family business considerations or my mother's opinions on appropriate timing." The simple acknowledgement that our reproductive choices would be made based on our own desires rather than Mitchell Healthcare priorities represented perhaps the most profound shift in our marriage dynamic. "Let's keep talking about it," I suggested, "along with all the other adjustments we'll need to navigate if you become CEO." As we left the restaurant and walked along the harbor in the cool evening air, I reflected on the journey of the past year. My dramatic establishment of the research center had been a turning point not just professionally, but personally. A reclamation of agency that had transformed not only my own life, but James's as well. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, slipping an arm around my waist as we paused to watch the moonlight on the water. "I was just thinking about what we've built this past year, and not just the research center. This new version of us. It's stronger than what we had before, isn't it?" He considered this thoughtfully. "It is. There's more truth between us now. Less accommodation and more genuine partnership." "And with your family?" I prompted, curious about his assessment of that still evolving dynamic. "Complicated," he acknowledged with a rueful smile. "Dad respects what you've accomplished, even if he'd never admit it directly. Mom is still adjusting to the concept of a daughter-in-law with an independent professional identity. And professional recognition that rivals her son's," I added, referencing the recent feature in Medical Innovation Quarterly that had highlighted my work alongside profiles of other emerging leaders in medical research. "That particular development has not gone unremarked upon in family discussions," James confirmed, his tone making it clear that Eleanor had been less than enthusiastic about my growing prominence in medical circles. We continued our walk, discussing the practical aspects of the coming weeks. James would remain at the research center for 7 days before returning to Boston for board meetings, while I would travel to Chicago the following month to present our latest findings at a major medical conference. When we reached the small cottage I had purchased 6 months ago, a 15-minute drive from the research center with a stunning view of the water, James paused at the door. "You know, there's a third option we haven't really discussed," he said, his expression thoughtful. "For the CEO position." He leaned against the porch railing, facing me directly. I could decline it. The suggestion startled me. "James, you've worked toward this your entire career. The Mitchell legacy is important," he acknowledged. "But maybe there are other ways to honor it besides stepping directly into my father's role. Daniel has the business acumen for the position. With the right team around him, he could be effective." "What would you do instead?" I asked, genuinely curious about this unexpected possibility. "Continue developing my consulting practice. Maybe expand my role with the Kendall Initiative if there's genuine need. Or establish something new that bridges these different worlds we've been navigating." He smiled slightly. I'm discovering there's something liberating about defining my own path rather than following the one mapped out since birth. It was perhaps the most tangible evidence of how profoundly our relationship had evolved. That James could even contemplate stepping away from the position he had been groomed for throughout his life. Whatever you decide, I said, it should be about what you truly want, not just what accommodates our situation. He nodded, understanding the distinction. I know, and that's why I'm actually considering all options rather than automatically accepting what's expected. Inside the cottage, we settled on the sofa overlooking the water, the conversation shifting to more immediate matters. The details of the coming week, coordination of our schedules, plans for the weekend. The domestic normalcy of these discussions contrasted sharply with the weightier topics of professional trajectories and family legacies, yet together they formed the texture of our reconfigured relationship. Later, as James slept beside me, I found myself awake, considering the journey that had led us here. The dramatic revelation at Cascadia Grove a year ago had been a catalyst for change, but the true transformation had unfolded in the countless small moments that followed. The difficult conversations, the negotiated boundaries, the gradual rebuilding of trust on new terms. What I had initiated as an assertion of professional identity had evolved into something more profound, a recalibration of our entire relationship dynamic, shifting from accommodation to genuine partnership. The research center that had once represented my declaration of independence now stood as proof that autonomy and connection could coexist, that supporting each other's ambitions strengthened rather than diminished our bond. The following morning, I woke early and slipped quietly from bed, drawn to the deck overlooking the water. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow across the still surface of the bay. In the distance, I could see the outline of the research center perched on its bluff, a physical manifestation of the path I had chosen. James joined me a few minutes later, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders against the morning chill before standing beside me in comfortable silence. Together, we watched an eagle soar over the water, its powerful wings catching the updrafts with effortless grace. Beautiful, James murmured. Yes, I agreed, though my thoughts had shifted from the natural splendor before us to the less visible but equally remarkable transformation of our lives. It really is. After breakfast, we drove together to the research center, arriving just as the team was beginning to filter in for the day. As we walked through the entrance, I noticed several researchers glance our way with quiet acknowledgement, accustomed now to the presence of Dr. Mitchell alongside Dr. Kendall, understanding the unique dynamic we had established. I'll be in the regulatory compliance office if you need me, James said as we reached the main corridor where our paths would diverge. The FDA liaison is calling at 10 to discuss the expanded trial parameters. Perfect. I'll be in the lab most of the morning, but we should sync before the team meeting at 2. He nodded, then surprised me with a quick kiss, a small but significant departure from the strictly professional boundaries we had initially maintained within the research center. Go change the world, Dr. Kendall. One autoimmune protocol at a time, I replied with a smile. As I watched him head toward the regulatory office, a space that had gradually become his own professional domain within the larger research center, I was struck by how naturally we had evolved into this new dynamic, finding balance between autonomy and partnership that had seemed impossible in the shadow of Mitchell Healthcare's all-encompassing influence. In my office, I found a delivery waiting on my desk, a package from Boston with Mitchell Healthcare's return address prominently displayed. Inside was a copy of the company's annual report, with a post-it note in Richard's distinctive handwriting. Thought you might find page 37 interesting. Armai. Curious, I turned to the indicated page and found a brief announcement regarding the establishment of a new division within Mitchell Healthcare, focused on long-term therapeutic research, with independent scientific direction. There was no mention of my input or the Kendall Initiative's influence on this development, but the very existence of such a division so contrary to Richard's traditionally commercial approach, spoke volumes about the subtle shifts occurring within the Mitchell empire. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "I see Dad sent you the annual report. The new research division was James's idea, but don't tell Dad I told you that. Call me next time you're in Boston. I have a proposition that might interest you." The message confirmed what I had suspected, that James had already begun influencing Mitchell Healthcare's direction, planting seeds of change that might eventually transform the company's approach to medical innovation. As I prepared for my day, changing into my lab coat, reviewing research notes, checking the schedule of experiments, I found myself reflecting on the curious path that had led me here. What had begun as a bold assertion of professional identity, triggered by exclusion from a family retreat, had catalyzed a comprehensive reorganization of both my career and my marriage. The suitcase I had packed a year ago, filled with research documents and professional credentials rather than vacation attire, had indeed left Eleanor Mitchell speechless when she realized its implications. But more importantly, it had opened the door to a version of my life where professional fulfillment and personal happiness weren't mutually exclusive propositions. Over the next 6 months, as Richard's retirement approached and James grappled with his decision about the CEO position, our lives settled into a rhythm that would have been unimaginable before my declaration of independence. We maintained our bi-coastal arrangement, with James spending increasing amounts of time at the research center as he gradually delegated more of his Boston responsibilities in preparation for whatever decision he would ultimately make. The Mitchell family dynamics continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Richard, perhaps sensing that his son's commitment to the traditional family business model was wavering, began making subtle overtures toward me. These weren't personal reconciliations so much as strategic accommodations, invitations to review specific Mitchell healthcare research initiatives or provide feedback on potential acquisitions in the autoimmune space. I accepted these professional engagements with careful boundaries, participating as a respected scientific consultant rather than a dutiful daughter-in-law. Each interaction reinforced the new terms of our relationship: mutual professional respect without personal subjugation. Eleanor's adaptation proved more challenging. Her deeply ingrained beliefs about family hierarchy and appropriate roles for Mitchell spouses made my continued independence difficult for her to accept. Her interactions with me remained formally polite, but emotionally distant, marked by occasional barbed comments about modern marriages and the sacrifices of previous generations. When James and I attended the annual Mitchell Foundation Gala in Boston, my first appearance at a major family event since establishing the research center, Eleanor's greeting was a masterclass in social restraint. "Rebecca," she said, air kissing beside my cheek, "how nice of you to join us. I understand your research is quite demanding these days." "It is," I confirmed pleasantly, "but some priorities transcend professional commitments." Her eyebrow arched slightly at my choice of words, but before she could respond, James appeared at my side, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back. "Mom, have you seen the latest patient outcomes from Rebecca's protocol? The remission rates are remarkable." It was a deliberate redirection, shifting the conversation from personal dynamics to professional substance, a strategy James had developed over months of navigating the complex territory between his wife and his mother. More significant than the tactic itself was the fact that he employed it automatically, prioritizing my professional recognition over his mother's social expectations. Eleanor's response was equally revealing. Rather than dismissing the research topic as inappropriate for a social occasion, as she once might have, she engaged with it directly. "I've heard there's interest from European medical centers," she said, surprising me with her awareness of our international collaborations. "Richard mentioned the Munich Institute has been particularly attentive." The conversation that followed was stilted but substantive, focused on the actual work rather than family politics, perhaps the most authentic exchange Eleanor and I had shared in years. Later that evening, as we danced at the gala, James whispered, "Did I just witness my mother attempting to discuss autoimmune research protocols?" "I believe you did," I replied, equally amazed. "Though I suspect her sudden interest has more to do with your pending CEO decision than any newfound passion for immunology." He laughed softly. "Probably, but it's progress nonetheless." 2 weeks later, James made his decision. We were sitting on our cottage deck, watching the sunset paint the water in vivid oranges and pinks, when he turned to me with the calm certainty that had become more pronounced in him over the past year. "I'm going to accept the CEO position," he said, "but on my own terms." "Which are?" "A restructured leadership model, less centralized control, more distributed expertise. Daniel taking a larger role in day-to-day operations. The new research division receiving guaranteed funding protected from quarterly profit considerations." He took my hand. "And a more flexible approach to where the CEO actually resides." "Meaning?" 3 weeks in Boston, 1 week here. Plus remote work capabilities that would have given my father heart palpitations 5 years ago. He smiled. The Mitchell Healthcare Board wasn't thrilled with the arrangement, but they're even less thrilled by the prospect of me declining the position and them having to conduct an external search. It was an elegant solution, allowing James to honor the family legacy while preserving the independence we had both come to value. Still, I had questions. "And Richard? He's accepting this revised approach to Mitchell leadership?" James laughed. "Accepting might be an overstatement. Grudgingly acknowledging the necessity of evolution would be more accurate." His expression grew more serious. "But beneath the resistance, I think he's relieved. He's been carrying the weight of the company for 40 years. Seeing it transition to the next generation, even in a form he wouldn't have chosen, brings a certain closure." "And us?" I asked, gesturing between us. "How does this change things?" "Practically, not much. We'll maintain the cottage here, and I'll need a dedicated office space at the research center for the weeks I'm working remotely." He squeezed my hand. "Personally, it means I'm fully committing to this balance we've created, to a marriage, where both our professional passions have equal weight." The conversation marked a turning point, not just for James, but for our relationship. What had begun as a reluctant accommodation to my declaration of independence had evolved into a deliberate choice, a conscious embracing of a partnership model that diverged radically from the Mitchell tradition. Richard's retirement ceremony, 3 months later, reflected these shifting dynamics. Held at Mitchell Healthcare's Boston headquarters, the event brought together company executives, medical industry leaders, and family members to honor his 4 decades of leadership. I attended as both James's wife and as the director of the Kendall Institute, with my dual identity acknowledged openly rather than obscured. During his speech, Richard surprised me by referencing our work directly. "The healthcare landscape is evolving," he said, "and Mitchell Healthcare must evolve with it. The next generation brings new perspectives on research pathways and therapeutic applications, perspectives that challenge traditional thinking but ultimately strengthen our commitment to medical advancement." His gaze moved briefly to where James and I stood together. Sometimes the most valuable innovations come from unexpected directions. It wasn't a direct apology for years of marginalization, but from Richard Mitchell, it was an extraordinary acknowledgement, a public recognition that the very independence he had resisted had ultimately influenced Mitchell Healthcare's evolution in positive ways. Later, during the reception, he approached me directly, something he had rarely done since the confrontation at Cascadia Grove. "Your latest protocol modifications," he said without preamble. "The adaptive response elements, they show promise for applications beyond autoimmune conditions." "We believe so," I replied, surprised by his specific knowledge of our recent research developments. The targeted immune modulation could potentially apply to certain inflammatory responses in cardiovascular conditions as well. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Mitchell Healthcare's new research division might benefit from consultation on those potential applications. On a formal basis, of course, with appropriate compensation and intellectual property protections. It was as close as Richard would ever come to admitting the value of the research path he had previously dismissed as too experimental, and perhaps as close as we would come to reconciliation. "I'd be open to discussing potential collaboration frameworks," I said carefully, "though the Kendall Initiative's independence remains non-negotiable." "Understood." He raised his glass slightly. "To scientific progress, regardless of institutional affiliation." It was a toast that acknowledged our new reality: professional respect without personal subordination, collaboration without absorption. James's transition to CEO over the following months brought its own challenges and revelations. The bi-coastal arrangement proved more complex in practice than in theory, with certain Mitchell healthcare crises demanding his physical presence in Boston regardless of our carefully structured schedule. But unlike in the past, these disruptions were treated as mutual problems to solve rather than expectations I should automatically accommodate. When a major regulatory issue erupted during James's scheduled week at the research center, we sat together in my office, reviewing options. "I need to be in Boston tomorrow for the FDA meeting," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "But we have the protocol review with the Johns Hopkins team scheduled for Thursday." "Go to Boston," I said simply. "I'll handle Hopkins. We'll reschedule your regulatory sessions with our team for next week." "I was supposed to be here for 10 days this time," he reminded me. "This cuts our time by half." "And we'll deal with it," I assured him. "This arrangement was never going to be perfect, James. What matters is that we're both committed to making it work, adjusting as needed without resentment." It was perhaps the most significant difference from our previous dynamic, the absence of martyrdom or scorekeeping, replaced by a pragmatic partnership approach to navigating competing demands. 8 months after James became CEO, I made my own significant decision. We were reviewing research data in my office late one evening when I closed my laptop with unexpected decisiveness. "I think it's time," I said. "For dinner? I could order something in if you want to keep working." "No," I smiled at his confusion. "For us to start trying for a baby." His expression shifted from surprise to cautious joy. "Are you sure? With everything going on, your research, my new position?" "There will always be something going on," I pointed out. "What's different now is that we're making this decision based on what we want, not what's convenient for Mitchell Healthcare or aligned with family expectations." We discussed the practical implications well into the night, how my research responsibilities might be temporarily redistributed during maternity leave, how James might adjust his Boston schedule, what childcare arrangements would accommodate, our unique living situation. Every aspect of the conversation reflected our new reality: two professionals making family planning decisions as equal partners, with both careers given genuine consideration. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, I stood in our cottage bathroom staring at a positive pregnancy test. The emotion that washed over me was complex. Joy intermingled with anxiety about the changes ahead, excitement tempered by awareness of the logistical challenges we would face. When I showed James the test results, his reaction was equally nuanced. Beneath his obvious happiness was a thoughtfulness that reflected how much he had evolved from the Mitchell heir who once unquestioningly accepted his mother's assessment of convenient timing for family expansion. "Everything changes now," he said, holding me close. "But unlike my parents, we won't let a family business define our family relationships." The pregnancy announcement to the Mitchell family revealed much about the new dynamics we had established. Rather than deferentially seeking Eleanor's approval or accommodating Richard's business concerns, we simply informed them of the expected, arrival of their grandchild, and our intention to maintain both our professional commitments and our bi-coastal living arrangement. Eleanor's response was predictably focused on logistics. But where will the baby actually live? Children need stability, a proper home. The baby will live with us, James replied simply. In both homes. Families take many forms these days, Mom. Richard, surprisingly, proved more adaptable. The San Juan Islands are an excellent environment for a child, he observed. Clean air, natural surroundings, and Boston provides cultural advantages. A dual perspective could be beneficial. His practical acceptance, so at odds with Eleanor's traditional concerns, highlighted how fundamentally the family dynamic had shifted since my rebellion at Cascadia Grove. As my pregnancy progressed, the research center continued to thrive. My team stepped up admirably, taking on additional responsibilities as I reduced my laboratory hours while maintaining my directorial oversight. The expanded clinical trials showed increasingly promising results, with patient improvement rates that attracted attention from major medical centers worldwide. At 6 months pregnant, I delivered a keynote address at the International Autoimmune Research Symposium in London, my growing belly visible evidence of my dual identity as scientist and expectant mother. The standing ovation that followed my presentation of the Kendall Protocol's latest refinements confirmed what I had always believed, that professional accomplishment and personal fulfillment were complementary rather than mutually exclusive. James attended the symposium, sitting in the front row with unmistakable pride as I presented our findings. Afterward, as we walked through Hyde Park, he broached a subject we had been circling for months. "I've been thinking about names," he said, his hand resting lightly on my belly. "What about keeping Kendall?" "As a first name?" I asked, confused by the suggestion. "As a last name," he clarified. "For all of us, actually." I stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "You want to change your name from Mitchell to Kendall? Or perhaps a hyphenation, Kendall Mitchell or Mitchell Kendall?" He met my gaze directly. "The point is, I don't want our child to automatically take only my family name, as if your identity were secondary. Whatever we decide, it should reflect both lineages equally." It was perhaps the most profound evidence of how completely our relationship had transformed, that James Mitchell, heir to a medical dynasty built on family name recognition, would consider adopting or incorporating his wife's surname rather than automatically imposing his own. "Your parents would be devastated," I pointed out, "especially your father. The Mitchell name on company letterhead, but not on his grandchild's birth certificate." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but they're already adjusting to so many changes. My modified CEO role, our bi-coastal living arrangement, your independent research center. This would be one more evolution in how the next generation of the family defines itself." We didn't resolve the name question that day, but the conversation itself marked how profoundly our relationship had been reconstructed, built now on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than predetermined roles. In my 8th month of pregnancy, we gathered both our families for a celebration at our San Juan Islands cottage. My parents, initially concerned about the dramatic changes in my life over the past 2 years, had gradually come to appreciate the reclaimed independence they now saw in me. The Mitchell family's presence, Richard and Eleanor, Olivia and Thomas, Daniel and Sophia, represented a tenuous but significant reconciliation, a tacit acknowledgement of our new family construct. As we sat on the deck overlooking the water, Eleanor watched me carefully, her expression unreadable. Later, as others engaged in separate conversations, she approached me where I stood admiring the sunset. "This is quite different from how I envisioned my first grandchild's arrival," she said, her tone neutral. "I imagine it is," I agreed, one hand resting on my rounded abdomen. To my surprise, she continued, "My own mother-in-law had very specific ideas about how I should conduct myself as a Mitchell wife. The expectations were comprehensive. It was the first time Eleanor had ever hinted at her own experience of joining the Mitchell family, of possibly having faced similar pressures to conform. "Did you ever consider a different path?" I asked carefully. She gazed out at the water, silent for so long I thought she might not answer. "Once," she finally said, "before Daniel was born." I had studied architectural design, nothing as impressive as your medical credentials, but it was something I excelled at. Richard's father made it clear that outside careers were distractions from family priorities. The revelation stunned me. This glimpse of a young Eleanor with creative ambitions, before she had fully embraced the role of Mitchell family matriarch. "I don't regret the choices I made," she added firmly. "The Mitchell legacy has been worth preserving." "I believe that too," I said, surprising both of us with my sincerity. "Just not at the expense of individual fulfillment. There has to be room for both." She studied me thoughtfully. "You've changed him, you know. James. His vision for the company is different from what Richard and I anticipated." "He's changed. Himself," I corrected gently. "I just created space for him to consider alternatives to the predetermined path." Eleanor nodded slightly, her hand moving tentatively toward my belly before hesitating. I made the decision for her, taking her hand and placing it where the baby had been kicking. Her eyes widened at the movement beneath her palm, a fleeting vulnerability crossing her usually composed features. "Whatever name this child carries," she said, surprising me with her awareness of our ongoing discussion, "he or she will be a Mitchell in part. Some legacies transcend surnames." It was as close to a blessing as Eleanor could manage, an acknowledgement, however qualified, of the new family dynamic we were creating. 2 weeks later, our daughter was born at a small hospital near our cottage, with James by my side throughout the intense but ultimately straightforward delivery. When the nurse placed her on my chest, tiny and perfect with a shock of dark hair, the magnitude of what we had created, not just a child, but a new model of family, overwhelmed me. "Hello, Claire," I whispered, using the name we had chosen together, honoring both our mothers' middle names. "Welcome to our complicated, wonderful world." James, his eyes shining with tears, leaned down to kiss my forehead. "Claire Elizabeth Kendall Mitchell," he said, confirming the decision we had reached after weeks of thoughtful discussion. A name that honors both her histories. The hyphenated surname had been our compromise, acknowledging both lineages while creating something new that was uniquely hers. The choice symbolized everything we had built over the past 2 years, a partnership of equals, respecting tradition while refusing to be constrained by it. When Richard and Eleanor arrived the following day to meet their granddaughter, the name on her hospital bracelet prompted a moment of visible adjustment from both of them. Richard studied it longer than necessary, his expression inscrutable, while Eleanor's lips tightened momentarily before she composed herself. But when Claire was placed in Eleanor's arms, names and legacies seemed to recede in importance. "She has the Mitchell chin," she observed, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "And your eyes, Rebecca." It was the first time she had used my first name without a hint of formality or distance, a small but meaningful acknowledgement of my place in her granddaughter's life, not just as James's wife, but as an essential part of Claire's identity. Over the following months, as we adjusted to parenthood while maintaining our professional commitments, the research center continued to flourish under the leadership structure we had established during my maternity leave. The Mitchell-Kendall family, as we had begun to call ourselves, settled into a rhythm that defied conventional expectations, but worked remarkably well for our particular circumstances. James adapted his CEO responsibilities to allow for more remote work, conducting video conferences from our cottage while holding Claire in one arm. I returned to the research center part-time when Claire was 3 months old, bringing her with me on days when laboratory work wasn't on my agenda. A comfortable nursery was established adjacent to my office, allowing me to nurse her between meetings and research reviews. The research team, many of whom had become surrogate family during our bi-coastal experiment, embraced Claire's presence with unexpected enthusiasm. Our lead immunologist, a serious man who rarely engaged in small talk, took to stopping by my office specifically to make silly faces at her. The statistical analyst, who had initially seemed indifferent to our personal lives, began bringing handmade toys crafted by her woodworking husband. Even more surprisingly, Richard and Eleanor gradually increased their visits to the San Juan Islands, ostensibly to see their granddaughter, but increasingly engaging with the research center as well. Richard, whose scientific background had been overshadowed by his business acumen, showed genuine interest in our laboratory work. Eleanor, channeling her architectural background, offered thoughtful suggestions for the design of our expanded patient treatment wing. On Claire's first birthday, we hosted a celebration at the research center, a symbolic merging of the personal and professional worlds that we had worked so hard to balance. As I watched our daughter, now taking her first tentative steps, toddle between the research team and family members gathered in the courtyard, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that transcended any single achievement. The suitcase that Eleanor had found a year and a half earlier, filled with research documents and professional credentials rather than vacation attire, had indeed changed everything. But the transformation went far beyond my professional reclamation or James's evolution as a leader. It had catalyzed a fundamental reimagining of what family could mean, how career and personal fulfillment could coexist, how tradition could be honored without being imprisoned by it. Later that evening, as James and I stood on our cottage deck, watching the sunset with Claire sleeping peacefully in her father's arms, he asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Mom hadn't crashed our vacation? If she hadn't found those research documents in your suitcase?" I considered the question carefully. I think change was inevitable. The pressure had been building for too long. My frustration, your conflicted loyalties. Something would have broken the pattern eventually. Maybe, he acknowledged, but it might have broken us instead of transforming us. The observation was insightful, recognizing that our crisis could easily have resulted in dissolution rather than evolution. That we had emerged stronger, more authentic in our connection, and clearer in our individual identities was not the predetermined outcome, but the result of countless choices we had made in its aftermath. "Thank you," James said suddenly, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "For what?" "For refusing to disappear, for demanding space for your brilliance, for showing me a different way to be a Mitchell. And a husband." He smiled down at our sleeping daughter. "And for this little one, who will grow up knowing both her parents as complete human beings rather than prescribed roles." In that moment, standing beside the man who had evolved from Mitchell heir to genuine partner, watching our daughter sleep peacefully in the space between our separate and shared ambitions, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with accommodation or compromise. We had created something new, a family defined not by subordination of one member's identity to another's, but by mutual respect for each other's fullest expression. What Eleanor had found in my suitcase wasn't just research documents, but the catalyst for a far more profound revelation. That genuine partnership, whether professional or personal, cannot be built on subordination or erasure of identity, but must grow from mutual respect for each other's unique contributions and inherent value. As the last light faded from the sky, casting the water in deepening shades of indigo, I rested my head against James's shoulder, our daughter secure between us. The research center stood silhouetted on its bluff in the distance, a testament to professional persistence. Our cottage glowed warmly behind us, a haven of personal connection, and we stood at the intersection of these worlds, no longer forced to choose between them, but free to inhabit both fully. It was worth it, I said, softly. Every difficult conversation, every boundary negotiation, every moment of uncertainty. This, I gestured to encompass our sleeping daughter, our home, the distant research center, and the two of us standing together as equals, was worth everything. James nodded, understanding all that remained unspoken between us. It was, and it still is, every day. As stars began to appear in the clearing sky, we turned together to carry our daughter inside, stepping forward into the future we had created. One neither of us could have imagined 2 years earlier when a mother-in-law crashed a vacation and found unexpected revelations in a suitcase. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.